My Ko-Fi supporters see my videos early. The link is in the description or on my channel if you want to support me. Nullius is one of the more conceptually interesting mods for Factorio. You play as a von Neumann Probe, designed to travel to a lifeless planet and seed life upon it, before creating copies of yourself to send to new barren planets. It seats itself as an almost prequel to Factorio, as you seed the grass, trees and biters which in a million years an unfortunate crash-landed engineer may end up fighting. The first order of business is to begin salvaging our own crash site for basic buildings. To begin in Nullius, you have nothing at all, literally zero crafting recipes, and to begin research you need to work with what you are already given. Among the ruins were some basic power infrastructure, so I get started placing down the solar panels and accumulators. We are given very few, and it will be a long time before we can build any more, although we do have a couple broken ones we can fix up to last us until we can research our own power generation. I said lifeless planet earlier, and I mean it. This planet has no life and never has, meaning no trees or coal or oil, nor even oxygen in the atmosphere. Our very first research requires no science packs, just a powered lab, and gives us minimal samples, the first step to understanding this planet on which we have found ourselves. Minimal samples require 3 raw resources found scattered on the surface of the planet: iron ore, sandstone, and bauxite. As it turns out, this planet only has 5 major resources, being the 3 just mentioned, as well as limestone and volcanic gases from the occasional fumarole. You might notice these little Spidertron head things floating around me, and they are companion drones included as part of the Nullius Maximus Modpack, which is what I am running. There are 3 main Nullius modpacks made by the Nullius developer: Nullius, Nullius Mementi, and Nullius Maximus, each adding mods on top of the previous. I went with this one because it sounded most fun, but it does add a lot of technologies into the game, all of which usually need to be researched to move on to the next set, so it might not be everyone's choice. In the background here, I just properly automated minimal samples. So we've found out what's in the ground, but what about the air and the water? Well, that's what climate samples are here to tell us, which are made by combining air and seawater. As it turns out, the air is mostly nitrogen and carbon dioxide, which for a lifeless planet one would expect to be about right. It does however mean no open air combustion, meaning that if we need to burn anything, we have to get our oxygen from an alternative source. Like I was talking about earlier, some of the buildings we were given from the crash site are broken and require fixing with some materials to use, such as these solar panels which we can fix with sand. Now, our first step is going to be to automate plastic, which is the first of the super complex crafting chains. I put together a little visualization to help make sense of this crafting chain whilst I build it. At the centre of the process is saline water electrolysis, which takes in saline water and zaps it into hydrogen, oxygen, chlorine and sodium hydroxide. To get saline water, we separate seawater into it, as well as a byproduct of wastewater, which we can simply void back into the nearest body of water. Next up, we take in air from the atmosphere and separate it into carbon dioxide and nitrogen, of which we only want the carbon dioxide, so we void off all of the nitrogen back into the atmosphere. We can combine the carbon dioxide and some hydrogen into methane, which also produces a byproduct of pure water. This methane can be combined with oxygen to make ethylene, which again produces a byproduct of pure water. Finally, the ethylene gets combined with chlorine, which gives us PVC, our first, and very poor, way of producing plastic, which creates a byproduct of hydrogen chloride. Of course, it couldn't be that simple. You see, this process is producing an excess of oxygen, water, chlorine and hydrogen chloride. The oxygen and water are fine, as we can void the excess using an overflow valve, but chlorine and hydrogen chloride would both be harmful to the life we are here to create if we were to void them, so we need to turn them into a less toxic chemical before we can get rid of them, the technology to do which we don't quite have access to yet. In the meantime, there is another resource we want, which also uses a lot of the same chemicals we're already producing, which is graphite. To create graphite, we take some of the carbon dioxide and hydrogen and combine it into carbon monoxide, which yet again creates pure water as a byproduct. Then, by combining carbon monoxide with more hydrogen, you get graphite and pure water. Now, if I went into every crafting chain in this much detail, I would probably be here all week, but I thought it was important to set the tone for quite how complex a mod this is, and give you a taste of the kind of thing I was putting up with for every recipe. We finally have access to a new source of power, wind power. It is just how you expect it to be, unreliable, but without any maintenance needed, the very definition of set and forget. Now, to get wind turbines, I had to start on our new science pack, mechanical prototypes. The recipe is simple, just 3 gears and a motor, which take an assortment of iron intermediates and plastic, and all that interesting really. You might notice that the focus is taken a bit off the assembly machines in this mod, as the majority of metal intermediates are made in these foundry buildings. Now, wind turbines have this thing called airspace, which essentially means you can't place a wind turbine too close to another, so they're going to have to be spread out all across the factory, rather than squished into one place like solar panels can be. I get a couple more researches done so I can build my own miners and get to work on a smelting stack. Producing iron like this creates a lot of gravel as a byproduct. It doesn't actually give you that much iron for the amount of ore you put in, but we're going to get better ways to produce iron later, so this will do for now. But with an iron stack set up, we can finally begin to automate the iron components and cut down on our handcrafting time significantly. In most mods it is wise to build a mall ASAP, but with all of the intermediates and complex crafting chains in Nullius, it seems wise to just automate all of the common intermediates and handcraft your way through to bots and provider chests, which come relatively early in the game. Talking about bots, these companion drones are kind of insane, and I don't see why I would ever need to upgrade to actual bots. If they weren't included in the mod pack, I definitely would not have included them by choice, but it's the mod author's choice, so I'm not going to hook a gift horse in the mouth. Because of the previously mentioned inefficiency of the iron ore recipe, I get even more furnaces placed down. It's worth mentioning that despite looking like the vanilla burner furnaces, they are in fact electric, due to the fact that this planet has literally 0 fossil fuels on it, meaning anything combustible we would have to make ourselves. This base isn't going to power itself, so I get started on the beginning of what is going to become a very extensive wind farm. You might have noticed that I use a cliff explosive here. The game gives you like 30 to begin with, but you don't get any more for like 20 hours, so they should be used wisely, not just to make a wind farm a little bit neater like I did. Back at the knot of chemistry, I set up filters which use graphite, iron, plastic and carbon dioxide, and they're an important ingredient in a lot of chemistry related buildings such as chemical plants, seawater intakes and others. I also begin automating pipes so that we don't need to rely on only the few scavenged from the crash. We can't quite automate underground pipes yet, however, as for some reason it needs sand, which we don't quite have automated yet. Sometimes the weird ingredients for buildings make sense, like electric poles in an electrolyzer, and sometimes it's sand for reasons. Wind turbines give us a way to generate power, but we won't reach accumulators for a long time, not even in this video, so we need an alternative way to store power for when the wind turbine output is low. An option that Nullius gives us is to use a surge electrolyzer, which only turns on when there is a surplus of power, and then recombine the hydrogen and oxygen in a combustion chamber to get steam, which we can store as essentially a power battery. The mod also gives us 3 different types of turbine, which we can swap between using the home button: backup, standard and exhaust. Standard turbines work like in the vanilla game. Backup turbines only turn on when accumulators would, and exhaust turbines run constantly, regardless of whether there is power demand. Due to us only having wind and solar power, backup turbines in standard will do the same thing, but later on when we get some active power generation, I'll change these turbines to backup. There are 2 things worth highlighting here. Firstly, this is in no way energy generation. For every megajoule of energy put into those electrolyzers, only 850 kilojoules come out of the turbines. It is energy storage, and not very good storage at that. Secondly, we are now using pure water electrolysis rather than saline water, so we don't need to worry about the chlorine and sodium hydroxide byproducts. However, we do need to purify the water prior to inputting it. When it came to actually connecting the thing, I found that I hadn't even researched seawater intakes yet, and I had gone through all of the ones from the crash site, so I had to quickly go and research it first. As you can see, I did build this with tileability in mind. The idea that if I ever needed more energy storage, I could just copy this over to the right ad infinitum. However, I never end up needing another one. You might remember the pure water byproduct from the plastic build. Well, with our ability to now electrolyse pure water, I can turn it into oxygen and hydrogen and feed it back into the system. My goal now is to scale up into a proper starter base, starting by building a bigger saline electrolysis plant. Yet again, I build it with tileability in mind, and yet again, I never make another one of these. I eventually get tired of handcrafting underground pipes, and decide to get them automated, which begins by crushing sandstone into sand and stone. All the stone I turn into bricks for building and paving, and the sand of course goes over to the pipe foundry. Notice the use of Bob's inserters here, which is included as part of the Modpack. Finally now, I can get around to finishing the saline electrolysis setup. You can see at the top, I fiddle around with the pipes to make them work with a tileable design. My immediate next step is to get to work on a setup to void all of the useless chlorine and sodium hydroxide. That's right, useless chlorine, because we've researched a much better plastic recipe which doesn't need it, leaving chlorine entirely useless for the moment. I set up a caustic solution which is made by combining sodium hydroxide and saline water and can be voided, giving us an effective way to get rid of one of our byproducts, but chlorine is still a problem. Naturally, it's a problem which we ignore for now, instead setting up pure water electrolysis to handle any pure water byproducts we produce later on. I include these top-up valves on the pipe, which means that pure water electrolysis outputs will be prioritised over the saline water electrolysis. Or it should mean that, but due to how low pressure these crappy tier 1 pipes are, the output of a valve can never actually reach a high enough pressure for it to stop trying to fill. I get carbon dioxide set up. Now to understand why I have pumps running into my tanks, you have to understand how pipes work in this mod. Every fluid structure, pipes and tanks has a maximum pressure, so if I have these tier 1 pipes with a maximum pressure of 40%, but then the tank has a maximum pressure of 85%, then the tank will never fill entirely, because the pressure inside can only reach 40%. A pump can pressurise the structure in front of it to any pressure, meaning that even though the incoming pipes only have 40% pressure, the pump can get the tank up to its maximum of 85%. This sounds boring and stupid, but it is important when deciding which fluid production takes priority. For instance, an overflow valve only lets things through if its inputs are above 75% pressure, meaning that if we aren't pumping the fluid into the tank, it will never get full enough to actually activate the valve, making it useless. When I was talking earlier about the top-up valves, the issue is that the top-up valve only lets fluid through if the outputs are at under 50% pressure, but due to the tier 1 pipes having a maximum of 40%, the output was always 40% or less, so the valve never actually shut. Anyway, this caustic solution does actually have a purpose besides getting rid of sodium hydroxide. When it is combined with hydrogen chloride, it makes brine, which can be voided. Now, I know I said the old plastic recipe, which by-produced hydrogen chloride, wasn't to be used anymore, but we can actually combine hydrogen and chlorine directly to make hydrogen chloride, which for now is a pretty decent way of getting rid of all this chlorine byproduct we're making. I accidentally paused my OBS and missed out on me building this steel setup to fulfill a research checkpoint, which is basically a technology where instead of doing the usual putting science packs into a lab, you instead have to produce, consume, or place enough of a specific item, in this case producing steel ingots, which is done simply by combining oxygen and iron in a foundry. The next step in this new plastic recipe is carbon monoxide. Where it diverges is the step after, alkene synthesis. By combining the carbon monoxide and hydrogen in a distillery, we get 3 different alkenes, reminiscent of advanced oil processing in vanilla. Naturally, we don't use these chemicals in the ratios they are provided to us, so we're going to need to find some way of disposing of the ones we have too much of. The first thing to do is pump them all into tanks so we can take advantage of overflow valves. Now we can burn off any excess of the 3 chemicals by combining it with oxygen in a combustion chamber. Quite usefully, the process outputs carbon dioxide as well as steam, so some of the CO2 we put into the process can be reclaimed, furthering our throughput. I think for a while about what type of turbine this should be. The correct answer is absolutely exhaust, by the way. It's not worth risking a deadlock for a paltry amount of power. Yet, I managed to land on standard. Before I start producing plastic, I remember that I'm still not actually doing anything with all that chlorine I'm producing, so I'd best get around to that, I suppose. My solution for the moment is to just turn it all into hydrogen chloride, which, as I said earlier, is okay for now, but leaves very little caustic solution for anything else, which is problematic for an important resource we will soon be getting access to. Finally, I can get around to making this plastic. By combining propene and ethylene in a flotation plant, we get polypropylene and 0 byproducts. Nice. This is, suffice to say, leagues better than what we were having to do before. We already have all the ingredients for graphite, so I shot it down in preparation for iron smelting. But Ryan, you might say, iron smelting doesn't need graphite. And you would have been right earlier, but we've unlocked a new, and more efficient, iron ingot recipe, requiring us to first crush the ore, and then combine it with graphite to get more iron for the same amount of ore, though we do still get some gravel. I get on Factory Planner, and start off quite optimistic, thinking I'm going to be making 2 yellow belts of iron, but quickly realising I don't want to have a furnace stack that big, so I half the amount and realise I don't want a furnace stack that big either. The solution is quite simple. I crush a lot of sandstone into a lot of sand and stone, and turn the sand into silica, voiding the wastewater also created in the process, and then I can smelt that silica into crucibles and refractory bricks, which I can then use to make tier 2 furnaces. This mod has conditioned me to see that as quite simple. Anyway, the iron crushing process produces excess stone, so we need to separate it and we can deal with it a bit later. We then smoosh the graphite belt in between these 2 crushed iron belts, and finally I can start building the smelting stack itself. I'd like to remind you that besides the alkene and plastic production, everything I have built up to this point has been necessary to make this process work. Even despite me cutting the number of furnaces down twice, it is still very big for just a single yellow belt of throughput. Whilst I accumulate the necessary materials to build the furnaces I need, I get started on the waste disposal area. Smelting produces a lot of gravel, but I also need to handle the stone byproduct from iron ore crushing, so I end up with a 2-step process where all the stone is crushed into gravel and combined with the other byproduct gravel, where it is then all crushed down into mineral dust. We then build some flotation cells, which we can use to submerge the mineral dust in acid and turn it into sludge. The acid in question we are going to use is hydrochloric acid, which is made by combining hydrogen chloride and pure water. The process of dissolving the mineral dust also produces carbon dioxide, which we can just hook up into the base. It's not an amazing byproduct, since it's essentially free to make anyway, but it is better than nothing. Disposing of the sludge takes one final step, where we simply combine it with seawater to make wastewater, which can then be dumped into the water. I said water too many times there. Now that we're effectively getting rid of all the byproducts in this process, all that's left to do is to fill in the rest of the furnace stack. Now we can craft some more furnaces. Whilst I wait for just the last few to craft, I start planning out how to produce our next important material, aluminum. This is another one of those crafting trees I'm going to go deep into, because it is probably the most complex thing we will see in this video. Naturally, however, I get distracted before I start on it, and start working on scaling up some science. My aim is 10 science per minute, which is more than enough for the moment, as most techs cost no more than 20 science packs. Unfortunately, to build more labs, we need the 4th science pack, so for now, we're just stuck with the 1. Further distracted, I start setting up our iron component mall thing. off this new iron line. I then bring plastic over and get started for mechanical prototypes, for which I just copy the mortar and gear builds and awkwardly attach them down below. Surely now, with all that science done, we can get around to aluminum processing, right? Yes, actually. Aluminum starts out as bauxite, the yellowish material we have been using so far only for mineral samples. We crush it down into crushed bauxite, which also yields crushed iron and sand, which we just feed into their respective production areas. The next step requires caustic solution, so we're going to go back and talk about that for a moment. Caustic solution is made, as you know, by combining sodium hydroxide and saline water. Now, to produce sodium hydroxide, we use saline water electrolysis, which also produces chlorine. Up to this point, we've been using caustic solution to void this chlorine, but this ends up meaning that for every volume of caustic solution we produce, the majority of it goes to neutralising the chlorine produced by its creation. I don't quite realise the correct course of action for this yet, so I'll leave that as it is for now, and end up with a crippling caustic solution shortage, though I will talk about the solution when I eventually get to it. Back at the aluminum plant, we combine the crushed bauxite with caustic solution, which gives us aluminum hydroxide and sludge. The sludge we can just send off to be turned into wastewater, but the aluminum hydroxide we then smelt into alumina, which finally smelts alongside graphite into aluminum ingots and aluminum carbide. The ingots are obviously what we want, but we still need to deal with the carbide. By combining aluminum carbide with water, we get aluminum hydroxide, which can then be fed back into the alumina production, and methane, which we mostly just store and void, but we will make some use of later. This rubber plant just sort of appeared. Assumedly, I built it when I accidentally left OBS paused, but thankfully its crafting is quite simple. All it is ethylene combined with steam to make butadiene, and then benzene and ethylene combined to make styrene, and the two are combined in a flotation plant to make the rubber. I soon start to get research queued up for a new power source, thermal solar, which is a sort of worst of both worlds between vanilla solar and nuclear. Like solar, it takes up a lot of space, and like nuclear, you have to feed it a lot of water and mess around with heat pipes and exchanges. In exchange, however, we get something we haven't been afforded so far in this run: predictable power, as despite its downsides, it is at least tied to the day-night cycle, unlike wind power, whose ebb and flow is completely random. I get a quick steel setup built to make components before moving on to the aluminum components. With it, I can get to work on these oh so cherished thermal solar panels we wanted. By combining aluminum sheets, tier 2 pipes and water, we get heat pipes, but for the panels themselves I need glass, so I bring a belt of silica down here for a little glass setup. I route it messily through the iron build, and with that we have our thermal solar panels automated, albeit slowly. I get started trying to design a little power plant to trial the new power source, but Nullius does not make it easy for me. You see, if you don't want to purify the water before you input it into the heat exchanger, every side is for a different ingredient. As for example, boiling seawater produces wastewater too. Ultimately, I just decided to purify the water first and use closed turbines, which recondense 85% of the steam back into water, to reduce the amount of water purification I needed to do. And you know what? It works. And it would work even better if I had actually connected up the second column of heat exchangers to the water, as they don't pass it through. A bit later on, however, I got an even better idea. I can boil seawater and just get rid of the wastewater that produces, and then, after passing the steam through a condenser turbine, I get pure water and a bit of power. This gives us pure water whilst not just offsetting, but entirely reversing the power cost required. Now the problem here is obviously that if there is no power demand, then no pure water will be produced. But at the moment, we are often low on power, so it's unlikely we will run low on water, and later on when it becomes a problem, we have a way to fix it using exhaust turbines. Anyway, it's time to connect this up to the main chemical area. Up until this point, we've only been getting pure water from byproducts, so with a semi-reliable source, we will be able to expand our pure water electrolysis soon. Sick of using tier 1 pipes, I snap and automate tier 2s, which are made using plastic. Continuing the theme of strange underground belt recipes, These want gravel, which I just steal off my iron ingot production. In the midst of a crippling hydrogen shortage, and with our newfound pure water source, I add a whole 1 more electrolyser to the pure water electrolysis, which is a drop in the ocean compared to the kind of expansion I need to be committing to. I realise this soon enough and expand the plant to have another 4 electrolysers. The cause of this massive shortage is graphite, which between increased iron production and the introduction of aluminium is now spread very thin and needs expanding. We've spent enough time solidifying our base, and now it's time to expand it. Electrical prototypes are the next science pack, and the first of many resources we need to be producing to create it is silicon, which we're starting now. It's quite simple given what we already have, requiring just smelting silica in a furnace together with graphite. For the next step, I need to somehow get nitrogen down through this mess to where I was producing that silicon. By combining hydrogen chloride, nitrogen and silicon, we get polycrystalline silicon, as well as hydrogen and chlorine byproducts, which we can easily hook up to the existing lines. I go on a small side tangent for lubricant, which firstly needs methanol, produced by combining the methane byproduct from aluminum carbide recycling with oxygen. If we then combine the methanol with hydrogen chloride and silicon, we get hydrochloric acid and lubricant. Lubricant is going to be important because it's used in items such as red belts, train wagons, and much later on for another science pack. Back onto electrical prototypes, I brought together plastic, graphite, alumina, and aluminum sheets to make capacitors, the first primary ingredient. With just a bit of extra finagling, I bring together polycrystalline silicon, aluminum wires, graphite, and plastic to make logic circuits, the second primary ingredient. As you can see here, however, it cannot be made in a medium assembler. I need to downgrade to a small assembler to be able to produce it for reasons. I guess it's just a finicky thing to put together and needs the delicate hands of a smaller machine. Now with these 2 on belts, I just need to get to work on the other 2, slightly simpler ingredients. An immediate issue I am facing, however, is that my aluminum production is flagging due to a lack of caustic solution, due to a lack of sodium hydroxide, due to too much chlorine, which we need caustic solution to void. It's obvious that there must be a better way, but I don't see it yet and continue in my erroneous ways. I would like to explain how ridiculous this solution is. I am electrolysing a brine produced by hydrogen chloride neutralisation, which produces exactly as much hydrogen, chlorine and sodium hydroxide as was needed to make the amount of brine it electrolyses. It is simply a waste of space and power, and I don't know why the fuck I did it. Back to the electrical prototypes again, I start automating lamps, as they are the next ingredient. You might notice that the base is, well, a bit messy, and I need to come clean to you all. I accepted the Faustian bargain, sold my soul to the spaghetti, for what I have been told at least at this point was pretty okay pace. As you will see later, it does not particularly pay off. The 4th and final ingredient we need is insulated wire, which is simply made by combining aluminum wire and rubber. Before I can quite get around to making the science packs themselves, I had an epiphany about how to make this water purification plant work well. I will have a primary set of standard turbines, which only activates when there is power demand, and then a secondary set of exhaust turbines, whose outputs only get added into the system when the water level is low, utilising a top-up valve on the main tank. This allows the plant to both provide power only when needed, but also still provide water if it is required when power is fine. Back at science production, I lay down the assemblers which will be making our electrical prototypes. Despite how small production is, all ingredients being created in a single building each, this is enough for 10 science per minute, which will be more than enough for the foreseeable future. Probably the most important thing in this science pack is robots and logistics, so we will be able to create a bot mall and stop needing to handcraft everything. I get the packs connected to the labs, and all that is left now is to pick where to start. I pick some techs which sound useful, but obviously at this point, my big goal is to get bots, so I keep that in mind with every technology I pick. I set that lubricant I automated earlier to use, creating train wagons, which we will use to make a locomotive, which is an ingredient in a car, one of the new and useful items unlocked by purple science. The crafting recipe for a car is strange, but makes sense. You even need to provide the air to inflate the tyres, and the lamps to act as headlights. Cars take canisters containing a mix of hydrogen and oxygen as fuel, and spit out water canisters when consumed, which can be emptied and then filled back up with the oxygen and hydrogen. I go for a big explore in my car whilst research slowly trudges along. What I really need to find is iron, since my starting patch will be running low soon, and there isn't any at all in the local area. Back at the factory, I devise a devious plan to get rid of some of the chlorine which has been pulling down my caustic solution reserves, by turning it into plastic. This recipe is bad, don't get me wrong, but there is still the main plastic production which can catch up if it's too slow, and any chlorine you can get rid of is a big plus. My next part of call is to completely eviscerate saline water electrolysis from the face of the earth. Rather than electrolyse saline water directly, we first distill it into pure water and brine, before electrolysing both of them separately. At the time, I didn't know if this was any better than what I was doing before, and I still don't, but it at least cuts down on the amount of electricity we were wasting making oxygen just to vent it, as brine electrolysis produces none. Finally, the research which allows me to build more labs finishes, so I expand my science setup a little bit more. Unfortunately, it won't quite speed things up, as we are low on electrical prototypes due to an aluminum shortage, due to the ongoing caustic solution crisis. I come back the next day and realise my current power infrastructure is woefully insufficient, so I get to work on the mother of all thermal solar builds. I don't bother trying to glean any pure water from this, lest I accidentally kill power by backing up pure water. It provides 32 megawatts of power, and if I expand its solar field large enough, it will be able to run overnight on just the heat stored in the panels. It is by all means a behemoth. Next up, I automate train tracks, which we will use later on for, well, trains. The recipe is not actually too far removed from vanilla, taking gravel rather than stone, steel rods rather than iron, and with the added ingredient of plastic. Then I automated train wagons, which take a smorgasbord of different ingredients from lubricant to steel chests to all manner of steel components. Returning yet again to try to solve my caustic solution issue, I found that there is a slightly more efficient recipe, sodium hydroxide wise, and all I need to do is swap the saline water with the abundant pure water I have. It's not a massive upgrade, but I'll take anything at this point. Before I can get around 20 more new stuff, I need to expand steel, as the demand from the wagons has completely flatlined the tiny production I'd built. I end up with this pretty compact setup, all thanks to Bob's inserters, although if I really wanted to, I could have gotten the input belts and the inserters into the same row too. Thanks to all of the extra steel, I can start producing an important ingredient in higher tier buildings, mortar 2s. Since for the moment it's literally only used in buildings, and not even in massive quantities, I make only the one assembler, though I do leave room to add more later. With electrical prototypes, I unlocked Chassis 2, which is this mod's equivalent of power armour. With it of course comes a bigger equipment grid to which I had a lot of fabrication tools, increasing my handcrafting speed and therefore probably saving a couple hours of my life. At this point I unlocked compressors, which allow you to compress gases when power demand is satisfied, and then when it's in a deficit, decompress it through a turbine to release the stored energy. Similar to the earlier electrolysis based power storage, I found no use for this, as we are not far from an incredibly overpowered source of power. More on that later. Finally, I figure out how to solve our caustic solution crisis. As I mentioned earlier, most of the caustic solution we then use to get rid of the chlorine we make producing the caustic solution. My solution is to use up that chlorine elsewhere to widen our caustic solution margin. The key lies in limestone. You see, we can crush limestone down entirely into mineral dust with no byproduct, and if we then dissolve this mineral dust in hydrochloric acid, we essentially have a way to freely void chlorine. I control this belt so that mineral dust is only let in if we have more than 10,000 hydrochloric acid, as well as prioritising the mineral dust from the smelting byproducts to make sure we don't jeopardise any existing production chains. I also come to understand that my carbon dioxide production is woefully insufficient, so it's time to put together a proper build for it. In retrospect, I think I probably jumped the shark here, from woefully insufficient to extravagantly overbuilt. This can be best seen in the ridiculous amount of nitrogen voiding I'm having to do here, whilst the system slowly fills up. I've unlocked tier 2 electrolyzers, so in an effort to improve my hydrogen throughput, I've upgraded a couple of pure water electrolyzers. I also begin to scrounge together some ingredients tangential to purple science production for the next important intermediate, sensors. These are used in a multitude of items, from robots to train signals, so I want to get them out of the way sooner rather than later. It truly was a mistake for the mod author to provide me with both these small assemblers and Bob's inserters, as there truly is nothing left stopping me from making ugly little disgusting spaghetti messes like this. There are a lot of researches between me and robot logistics still, and truthfully, it's a massive pain to keep track of which ones are required and which aren't, so I decided to download the Ultimate Research Queue mod to do the thinking for me. All I do now is select the robot logistics tech, called Distribution 1 in this mod, and all of the necessary prerequisites will be queued, as well as giving me a rough ETA for when the research will be done. It settles at about 6 hours, though I have plenty of things I can do to speed that up in the meantime. First and foremost of which is just straight up increasing the production of every science. For electrical prototypes, I simply use small assembler 2s rather than 1s, before also doing this for mechanical prototypes. This won't immediately increase science production, as I haven't scaled up the ingredients, but now I can easily see what needs to be increased and build accordingly. The ETA on distribution temporarily drops down to 4, then 3 hours, but where it'll settle after the factory is allowed to run for a while is anyone's guess. Already, this extra production is straining the pure water supply, so I decided to build another one of those solar water purifiers. Rather than building it as far as I possibly could from the pure water electrolysis like last time, I instead put it in a much more logical place, just above the carbon dioxide build from a moment ago. You could have had a satisfying time lapse of it being built, but I instead decided to open the research screen like a lobotomite, so you'll have to forgive me. On the plus side, it appears the research ETA has held strong so far. Even with tier 2 crushers and haste modules, which are a sort of worse version of speed modules this mod adds, we aren't crushing enough limestone to void a satisfactory amount of chlorine, so I'm going to need to go bigger than this shitty little thing. I end up with this big fella, which should by all means be able to keep up with our demands for the foreseeable future. Another important resource which is now flagging is iron, due to us slowly but surely sucking the starter patch dry. Thankfully, there is a decently sized patch not a ridiculous distance away, which we can tap with our new medium miner 2s. That's right, after only 18 hours, we have miners as good as the basic electric ones you get in vanilla. I even get to set them out in a way which seems to infuriate everyone in the comments of my other videos. I also got beacons researched. Yeah, they come quite early in this mod, and my first part of call with them is these alumina furnaces, which I appear to have severely underbuilt earlier on. To get to the distribution tech, I have to yet again complete a checkpoint technology, this time being freshwater utilisation. I wasn't aware at the time, but freshwater is kind of a big deal, as due to being pumped up from the ground rather than from the sea, it has no salt in it, so it is only a single step in the hydro plant away from pure water. Needless to say, this would significantly improve our pure water situation if I were to realise this, but for now, it is relegated to this singular pair of underground pumps and a hydro plant. In preparation for the distribution tech, which should only be a little over an hour away now, I make these passive provider chests at the end of this little bus, fed by loaders, so they will be available to the bot mall. The holes in production created by increasing science production are starting to show by this point, so I'm constantly running around upgrading buildings or adding modules and beacons to make sure the base can sustain the current rate of research. Surprisingly at this point, the slowest science packs are the two basic ones, so they are now my focus. The fact is that these simple recipes are only designed to be used right in the beginning of the game, and there are some much more complicated, but much more efficient recipes which we are closing in on. The fact is that with a recipe this cheap and simple, even if it is slow, it's always going to be easier to just expand the shitty production than make a more complicated but smaller one. For the moment, I just shot down some more beacons and modules, but this is clearly not sustainable. If you were curious by now just how many of each building I had in this base, so was I, and I made a blueprint of the entire thing to check. Over 1,000 normal and underground pipes is quite a lot, but if I'm honest, I think the most interesting thing here is just that proper overview of the base, which goes to show quite how much of a mess it is. As if this mess wasn't bad enough already, I realise I can squeeze a haste module assembly into the sensor mess, which will make my life a bit easier as previously I was hand feeding an assembler to make them. As part of my further preparation for a bot mall, I make buffers for logic circuits and capacitors, which I will later turn into passive provider chests, as they are used in a lot of the more advanced buildings as well as in bots themselves. With distribution close on the horizon, I need to pick my next technology to target, and that ends up being geothermal power. Do you remember that really good power source I was talking about earlier? This is it. I'll talk more about why that is when I actually get to them. After deciding on where I was going to put the bot mall, I placed down all the roboports, or hangars as the mod likes to call them, to give me one less thing to do later. As well as that, I give all the metal intermediate area robot coverage, so I can connect the output chests to the mall too. Finally, the research finishes, and we are opened up into a new era of play. Immediately, I get to work on automating the most essential things: more robots, and more logistic chests. The chests are relatively simple, just a steel chest, an arithmetic combinator, and an antenna. But the bots are of course going to take a few more steps. At the moment, we are at the base of an exponential curve. Crafting is slow, but as more bots are slowly crafted, the whole process will speed up, which will mean more bots, which will mean more speed, which will mean more bots, which will mean more speed, which will mean more bots. You get the idea. If I was going to pin down the point where this run went into decline, this would be it. Now that I had my bot mall put together, my next logical thought was that now was the time for a train base. This is almost always the correct choice, but little did I know in this mod that I was on the cusp of something which would have made my life significantly easier if I had pursued it. Something else which will make my life easier is that I'm finally making use of these fumaroles. Using an extractor, I can gather volcanic gas, which is immediately fulfilling a research checkpoint, but is also useful for an improved climate sample recipe. The recipe requires volcanic gas, nitrogen and wastewater, and produces climate samples much faster than the initial recipe we were using. The best thing about it, you might notice, is that besides volcanic gas, the ingredients are all byproducts we were avoiding anyway. Whilst routing the sample over, we have a minor sodium hydroxide spillage. Another research checkpoint I need to fulfill is concrete, so I horrendously bootstrap it just to fulfill the requirement. This is a bit of a mistake. You see, the mod author is a smart guy, and these checkpoints exist for a reason. Just as the volcanic gas checkpoint was to nudge you towards the climate sample recipe, this was intended to clue you in for the next science pack, for which one of its ingredients is concrete. It would have paid back in spades for me to have automated it properly now, so I implore you, when you play this mod, if the mod author makes you do something, take a step back and think about why. In other news, geothermal power has just finished researching, so I'm pretty giddy about that, and get started trying to make a power plant. The upfront cost is humongous, but once the plant is placed and operational, it will output the power constantly, forever, and with zero maintenance. I consider momentarily using heat exchangers and turbines, but we actually unlocked a new type of turbine, a Stirling engine, which makes power from nothing but heat. The idea is similar, a massive upfront cost, but once created, it needs no water, only heat coming in and power going out. I built the setup over here near the prototype compression battery, as it needs compressed nitrogen to craft. I decided that my robot's exponential growth needed a little linear boost, so I fill up my crafting queue with logistics robots and go for a long drive to pass the time, and hopefully find some useful resources. More than ever at this point, our base needs a serious power boost. I've started producing the recently researched wind turbine tier 2s in the mall, but progress is slow and they are still just as unreliable as their younger sibling. Geothermal power could not come sooner, but we're still waiting on Stirling engines. A pretty cool thing this mod adds, which is useful for high robot traffic areas like this, is chargers. They are basically just really cheap robo parts, and all they do is charge, not providing any construction area or logistics. The mod also adds the opposite, buildings which provide the areas but do not charge, though I don't see as much usefulness in these. By filling up a canister with methanol, benzene and oxygen, we get a methanol canister, which is like one of those hydrogen canisters from earlier, but better in every way. Among its many uses is as a fuel for the new piece of equipment we just unlocked, the jetpack. Yep, moving around this Gordian knot of a base has just gotten a bit easier. Pipe Visualizer absolutely shines with a mod like this. By this point, I've finally crafted enough Stirling engines to make use of this geothermal plant I crafted. It could not be easier. Simply place the plant down on the fumarole, place down 10 Stirling engines, connect them all with heat pipes, and just like that, you have 8 megawatts of power forever, once it's heated up of course. It's worth noting that the plant itself says it produces 10 megawatts of heat, but the Stirling engines only operate at 80% of efficiency, so we only get 80% of that. I get chlorine barreling set up, which is an ingredient in the new improvised explosives we just unlocked. They're basically cliff explosives, but you have to handcraft them. It's mostly a stopgap solution prior to the proper recipe, which isn't unlocked until the next science pack. You're gonna recall that I said the run was starting to go into a decline earlier. Well, this is the point where it enters freefall. This train system I'm starting here was the biggest mistake of the run so far, and is responsible for hours of wasted time. And if I had just taken a step back and went for the next science pack, this video would have ended in a very different place. Consequently, I'm not going to go into detail on it. I'll show you the pretty builds, but it's all going to be obsolete once we have the next science pack. Chemical research. For example, these electrolysis plants are nice and make use of that new and quirky freshwater purification, but if I had waited and instead done steamy electrolysis, I would be directly producing compressed hydrogen and oxygen, which can be much more effectively transported as they are 3 times denser. There's nothing wrong with this air separation build per se, but again, I could be compressing this gas, which would make transportation by train far more efficient. The graphite build is okay, but there is a much better graphite production process in chemical science called methane pyrolysis. Also, this build is bottlenecked by waiting for the trains to bring carbon monoxide over from literally next door. If I was building smartly, I would have instead made it into a single factory which turns carbon dioxide and hydrogen straight into graphene, instead of breaking it into 2 factories. An actual smart thing I did with this setup though, is electrolysing the byproduct water and feeding the hydrogen back into the system to make it last a bit longer. For my chlorine and sodium hydroxide needs, I just go for saline electrolysis. Even if brine electrolysis might have been a bit more effective, power is no object now, as I've been slowly taking over every fumarole in the known world with my geothermal power plants. Yet again, you can see I designed it to be repeatable, and as is almost a theme in this video, I will never build another one. Here's what consolidating one of those fumarole fields looks like. It can be hard getting all 10 around the plant for some in the middle, but you can't really complain when it's free power forever. I'll let past me explain this bit. Good job we didn't miss much, yeah? This is basically just a scaled up version of the waste management area in the old base. Not a massive amount to say about it really. Limestone crushing included to get rid of all that excess chlorine from saline electrolysis. One thing I did do right with this base is that I avoid 0 chlorine using caustic solution, so I have more than I could ever need for when we get to aluminum processing. It is iron processing ore clock over here, and oh boy is it ugly. I have no idea what I was thinking of that pickup station. Certainly isn't expandable. Like everything else in this base, we get a much better iron ingot recipe later. I swear, the base roast is almost over. There's only a few more things worth showing before I realised my foolishness. Plastic production just uses the alkene synthesis path, and this is almost the most egregious ever, as chemical science gives us not 1, but 2 new plastic recipes, both of which are leagues beyond this one. I think it was somewhere in the process of building this aluminum build, I realised I had taken a misstep somewhere. You see, Literally one of the first technologies you research with chemical science is an improved aluminum recipe, which gives you way more ingots for the same amount of ore. So yeah, I'm going to come clean now. This entire last bit where I was showing you all the train base and how it could and should have been better, that's all just a glorified advert, because I want you to watch the next one, which is where I'm actually going to implement all of the cool stuff I was talking about. Before I do finish though, I should probably make a small chemical science build, so I can start chugging away through all these new fancy technologies. All that was missed when I forgot to record was me setting up concrete, and I put it onto a belt with sodium hydroxide here, which makes up our first two ingredients for chemical science. Then by combining compressed hydrogen and compressed nitrogen, we get ammonia, which we barrel up, giving us our third ingredient. Glass is our fourth ingredient, which I need to try and squeeze through this mess. We can then separate volcanic gas into carbon dioxide, air, and most importantly, sulfur dioxide, which we can combine with water to make sulfuric acid, our fifth ingredient. The final ingredient is a lubricant, and with that, we have our chemistry research packs. God, I should have done this about 10 hours ago. I can then hook them into the science build. I don't think it's a surprise that feeding the barrels for chemical science from a bot wall had no chance to ever keep up. So my first order of business is to actually set up a belted production line for barrels. The process of creating a barrel is a lot more involved than in vanilla. Taking a tier 1 tank, then upgrading it into a tier 2 tank, which is split into two smaller tanks that are individually combined with a valve to make 5 barrels. A single assembler will do, as the throughput is quite good. All the difficulty is in the myriad of different materials being brought together. Power is omnipresently a problem, so I turned this entire fumarole field into a power plant. Despite its obscene material cost, it feels quite cheap to get power so easily, though it does free up some brain space for the more complex chemistry related aspects of the mod. Despite the many hours I put into the train base over to the east, my first major choice of this episode is to just give up on it and start over elsewhere. To this end, I start to lay out an area using some stone bricks over to the west, which is where I'm going to start my new, and much more structured, hopefully, base. It consists of 2 columns. The smaller on the right is where the solids bus will go, and the larger on the left is where the fluid bus will go. And then the base will be built on either side, making use of the buses to hopefully greatly simplify the entire process. The train base, in the meantime, is a massive waste of UPS and power. So by fiddling with this train signal at the depots, I stop all the trains, which will slowly and eventually kill the whole thing. I could, and perhaps should, deconstruct it, but at this point technical terminology coming up here, could not in a million years be asked. Since aluminum and the new iron ingot free recipe both require caustic solution, I think it's safe to say it is the lifeline of a base, and it's what I'm going to be starting with. This little box is 1x3 chunks in size, which leaves us enough room to expand later if caustic demand spikes. To produce caustic solution, we're going to be separating saline water into brine and water, and electrolysing both, which will give us our precious sodium hydroxide, as well as supplemental supplies of hydrogen, oxygen and chlorine. Naturally, if we're producing caustic solution, we're also producing too much chlorine, so my next step is to see that our caustic solution is never limited by an excess of chlorine, using the mineral dust voiding process. I set up a little area near the lake here and work backwards from the end of the process, starting with voiding the sludge. Then I need to set up the mineral dust dissolving, which is where the chlorine is actually destroyed. It is worth noting that this setup is entirely to void excess chlorine. I'll build a separate setup for destroying the excess gravel and stone produced by the rest of the factory later. I then need to set up the whole limestone to mineral dust line, although I did wish I gave myself some more space, as I needed to get creative to fit it all in. With the limestone finally plugged in, that's our chlorine voiding needs satiated for the moment. Next up is the air separation build, and for it I've just copied the old one from the starter base, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Finally, it's time to make use of a newly unlocked process, being methane pyrolysis to create graphite. The recipe itself couldn't be easier, taking just methane and turning it into graphite and hydrogen. The problem came in my method of creating the methane, for which I made what I thought was a safe assumption that more complex recipe equals more efficient. What I ended up doing was creating ethylene, propene and benzene from alkene synthesis, and then using the ethylene and propene pyrolysis recipes to just turn it all into methane and benzene. This is a lot more complicated than it needed to be, and I will later replace this behemoth with the simple methane recipe we haven't used since the very start of the game. The meagre hydrogen and oxygen produced by the caustic solution setup will not be sufficient going forward, and indeed can't keep up with this graphite setup alone, so it's time to get around to some pure water electrolysis. The next course of action is iron production, for which I'm using the new iron ingot 3 recipe. It's a lot closer to aluminium ingot production, and I would love to walk you through it from the start, but I chose to build it from the end, so we're going to have to go at it a funny way. The final step is to smelt iron oxide, graphite, and crushed limestone in a furnace, which gives the ingots, gravel, and lime, as well as a bit of carbon dioxide. That gravel just gets fucked off to be melted elsewhere, but we can turn the lime back into limestone, which recovers half the cost, which you can see me doing here. We supplement the other half by crushing some more limestone we're bringing in. The graphite also obviously just comes from the bus, leaving the only last ingredient, iron oxide. You're going to understand my comparison to aluminum ingot processing now, as to get it, we're crushing iron ore, and then feeding the crush into flotation plants with caustic solution to make iron oxide, as well as sludge, which we're avoiding in the usual way. Here's the thing in action, anyway. It produces a yellow belt of iron, but the red belt is there, because when combined with all the byproducts, it obviously fills up more than a yellow belt on the way out. With our material processing bringing so much gravel into existence, we need to start working on ways to bring it back out of existence. So it's time for another industrially sized mineral dust toilet. I just built one of these a minute ago, so I won't dwell on it too much. Remember that mineral research recipe I mentioned, which I said was too complicated to be worth it? Well, my science target in this new base is going to be 120 per minute, so the better recipes are non-negotiable. Thankfully, it's actually a lot less complicated than I initially suspected, for reasons I will explain. You see, 3 of the 5 ingredients are crushed bauxite, sand, and crushed iron, all of which are created in the bauxite crushing process. And even better, the other 2 ingredients are crushed limestone and mineral dust, both of which can be created from crushing down limestone. All of this is to say that despite this being the complicated and therefore better recipe, this isn't really that complicated at all. Continuing through our list of materials we need to create to catch up with the old base, next up is aluminium. It is a new recipe, but you'll find it's very familiar, as most of the steps are the same as the old one, up until how we deal with aluminum carbide, where instead of turning it back into aluminum hydroxide, we instead combine it with more alumina to make a lot of aluminum ingots and some carbon monoxide. Something you'll notice is that the build only takes up half of the little box I built for it, and this only outputs half a belt of aluminum ingots. So if we need to upgrade to a full belt, it's as simple as just copying another one of these into the empty space. Of course, as with a lot of things in this mod, it's not all that simple, as the bauxite crushing actually creates extra crushed iron and sand, which we could probably incorporate into iron ingot and silicon production respectively, but which we instead are just going to void. Crushed iron can just be crushed further into gravel, which we slip into the existing voiding infrastructure, and sand can be combined with seawater to make wastewater, which we simply flush away. It can be tempting in this mod to make the absolute most out of every single byproduct, but if you're willing to bite the bullet and get rid of some of them, you might just save yourself some time and sanity. The catalyst for the mess I'm about to formulate was the realisation that both plastic and rubber share a lot of the same ingredients, and I kind of want a belt of both, which is pushing me to the limits of this little space I'm giving myself. The first step is alkene synthesis, which, as we've seen before, turns hydrogen and carbon monoxide into ethylene, propene and benzene. To balance ethylene and propene, we use ethylene or propene pyrolysis, and when we have too much of one, we pass it into the pyrolysis setup, which turns it into benzene, methane and the other out of the 2 chemicals. This leaves us with a lot of unused benzene and methane, but we'll get around to fixing that later on. Now I paused here, and then upon returning forgot to unpause OBS, meaning it looks like all of this shit spawned into existence out of nowhere, so I'll try to catch you up. We make styrene and butadiene, just like in the old rubber build, and then create ammonia using compressed hydrogen and nitrogen. We are also burning off excess benzene and just venting any excess methane into the air. Next up we're combining propane, oxygen and ammonia to create acrylonitrile, an ingredient in the new rubber recipe. Propane, oxygen and benzene can then be combined to make BPA, this time an ingredient for plastic. Putting together the acrylonitrile, butadiene, styrene and BPA, we get polycarbonate and acrylonitrile butadiene styrene blend, or PC/ABS, which is our new and very efficient plastic recipe. I should make it clear that even though I use the fancy names for full effect, in the context of the game, it's all the same plastic bars. You'll notice that to route the butadiene over to the plastic, I went outside of the little box I gave myself, and this is something which I'm sorry to say will only get more common as the base continues. Now, the rubber takes acrylonitrile as well as butadiene and a new chemical we're going to need to make called solvent. Solvent is going to be used a lot later, but for now a single assembler is enough to feed this build, and to make it we need to combine oxygen, carbon monoxide and methanol, which we can make from that methane byproduct. Once the rubber production begins, I realised that I was one assembler short of a full yellow belt of product, so I have to tack it on the end here. Now that I'm actually producing enough wastewater, I shot together a quick 120 signs per minute of climate research, which is easy with the improved recipe. I'm pulling all the sciences I build down here, since this is where I will eventually put all of my labs when I get to that point. Naturally, our next science is mechanical engineering research. However, unlike the last two, we still have to use this shitty first recipe, which leads to the assemblers for the packs themselves alone being this big. At some point, I unlocked more efficient recipes for iron components for the small price of a bit of hydrochloric acid, and I considered for a moment not using it to save the hassle. However, I would then have to build more iron production, so my better judgment took precedent, and I went with the better recipes. I ended up expanding iron production anyway, however, since it's going to be used for more sciences further down the line, as well as the mega mall I was planning to build at the end of the base. More on that later. Back at the mechanical research build, there are actually improved recipes for iron wire and sheets involving lubricant, but this time the desire to not have to build a lubricant overpowered the bit of my brain which said everything must be as efficient as possible. So I ended up just using the old recipes. But anyway, there's not much more of interest to this build, so I finished it and promptly moved on. I again paused the game, but neglect to unpause OBS, so this time a silicon build pops into existence. In the building of this setup, I made the erroneous assumption that more complex always equals better. It's almost like it's becoming a theme in this video, and use a new silica recipe which has negligible efficiency improvements, but gives us rutile as a byproduct. We'll talk more about rutile later, but another mess up I made was forgetting to actually route in the graphite for the silicon, so I have to kind of sneak it in an incredibly ugly way. My next act is to get started on electrical research, not realising I had neglected to produce a vital ingredient. See if you remember what it is. You've seen me build this science before, just on a smaller scale, so I'll skip forward to the moment I realised my mistake. You see, we need glass, and in no small quantity, so the old recipe just won't do it. We unlocked 2 new recipes since the old one, but only the newest one can keep up with the kind of volume we're demanding, and it is quite the list of stuff to start producing it. To start, I built the glass foundries themselves, and I think the number of inserters emptying into each and every building speaks for itself. I had at least the sense to use the old silica recipe, which saved me a lot of strife. The only problem was I am about as far from a lake as you can possibly get, and I need saline water to wash it. Now, instead of bussing it like a wise person, I just run off into the wilderness with underground pipes to hook it up to some random lake. The next, still relatively simple ingredient is lime, created of course just by smelting crushed limestone. By this point I'm struggling to keep the builds within the boundaries I set myself.
Stay in the box, no! Stay in the box, no! Get out of my skin!
If it's cultured to let your neat base descend into a bowl of spaghetti, then I'm going to make a hell of a fucking sourdough. I routed in alumina, which I'm stealing straight out of the middle of the aluminium build, and now all that's left is sodium sulfate and soda ash. The recipe I selected for soda ash has sodium sulfate as an ingredient, so these two ingredients are quite intertwined. Before I get too into building it, I make sure that these capacitors can be moved out of the foundries, so I don't accidentally end up locking them in. A fundamental piece of the puzzle I'm missing is sulfur, which is going to require me tapping some volcanic fumaroles and bringing the gas over. I separate it over here, and again I'm just voiding the air since it can quite literally be made out of thin air. Back at the glass setup, I combine the sulfur dioxide with water and oxygen to make sulfuric acid. I also realised I wasn't actually crushing the limestone before I was trying to smelt it, but fortunately this one crusher can handle all the throughput I need for it. Anyway, all sodium sulfate needs is sodium hydroxide and sulfuric acid, and whilst I wait for the sodium hydroxide to make its way here from the caustic solution build, I hook up the output belts to where they need to be, bringing us even closer to getting this glass build online. The only byproduct unaccounted for was calcium chloride, which is a new byproduct we haven't seen before, and which I haven't had time this session to deal with, so I left myself a little note for the next time. And that's precisely what I did when I got back to it, though I did leave this tank of it, as it's actually used in an improved concrete recipe. It's quite a nice byproduct as far as this mod goes, as it can simply be emptied into the water with no extra steps. Before I finish any of that, I had an epiphany about my graphite build, realising that rather than all of this complicated alkene pyrolysis, I could just be making the methane directly from carbon dioxide and hydrogen, so I decided to do that instead. With glass finally on the bus, I can feed it into my electrical research build and finish it at last. Insulated wire was easy, but as it turns out, you need quite a lot more lamp assemblers than I had expected, so any idea of these builds being even vaguely rectangular is thrown out the window, as I expand it out to the side here like a herniated organ. Now with all the electrical research done, it's time to start thinking ahead towards the final of the 5 sciences we had already built. Chemical research. Immediately, I know that my little brine electrolysis build will not in a million years keep up with the sodium hydroxide demand from chemical research, so I go to expand it quickly. As with all the other science builds, I start at the end, which gives me a good base for the rest of the build. Since sodium hydroxide and glass are already on the bus, I route them straight in before moving on to our first new ingredient, which is concrete, for which I'm using the better recipe like I mentioned earlier. Concrete, as it turns out, is quite complicated to make, so as much as I'd like to stay in the box, I ultimately have to come out of the box to keep building. Besides the addition of calcium chloride, however, the concrete recipe is largely the same, so we're just going to waltz through it to the next process. Ingredient number 4 is ammonia barrels, for which we're using a new barrel recipe we recently unlocked. It's another one of those improved recipes which are more of a trade-off than an actual upgrade, as although it takes far fewer steps to create, it's actually a bit more expensive than the original recipe, so I'm basically giving up efficiency for some reduced complexity. The ammonia itself is simple, again just combining compressed hydrogen and compressed nitrogen, and we fill up the barrels using this machine called a barrel pump, so all that's left is the 2 fluid ingredients for the science. The 2 being sulfuric acid and lubricant. Sulfuric acid you just saw me build, so I won't dwell, but lubricant I haven't made in a while, so I'll give you a little reminder. Lubricant takes a combination of methanol, hydrogen chloride and silicon, which spits out lubricant and hydrochloric acid. To deal with the hydrochloric acid, we just plug it into the soda ash setup, where it'll get used up. Chemical research finally starts to produce, meaning this base has almost entirely caught up with the old one. All that's left to do now is build the lab setup itself. I choose the area directly beneath the climate research factory for the labs, as it's not going to be used for much else, and the tangle of belts surrounding it make it unsuitable for any sort of a large setup anyway. For now I just took all the labs from the old base, but I'll get some more built at some point, as this isn't nearly enough for the 120 science per minute we're trying to make. You might remember the rutile I mentioned earlier, which was a byproduct from the silicon build. Well, now we're going to make some use of it. Some of you, if you're a nerd, will know that rutile is better known as titanium dioxide, for which we have a process to turn into pure titanium, also creating a byproduct of salt. As always, we're starting at the end of the process here, where we combine sodium, titanium tetrachloride, and argon in a flotation cell, and we're going to work our way back from there. The first ingredient I tackle is argon, which can be found in trace amounts in the planet's atmosphere. So to produce it, we're going to need to use a new air separation recipe, which not only gives us the usual carbon dioxide and nitrogen, but also residual gas, which can be further separated into argon, water and trace gas. The water and trace gas we will simply be voiding. Ingredient numero dos is titanium tetrachloride, which needs rutile, graphite and chlorine. It also produces mineral dust as a byproduct, which I route in a very disgusting way back to the dust sink. For our final ingredient, sodium, we take good old sodium chloride salt out of the sea and zap the chlorine out of it in an electrolyzer. You might remember that salt was an output of titanium production, so we can feed that back around to supplement this production. At this point I had a bit of a wobble in progress, as rather than follow my own advice from last video and properly automate checkpoint objectives, I decided to spend some time hand feeding the next few. Namely, are these batteries, which are very important in a lot of the new recipes, but take such a smorgasbord of random materials I couldn't be bothered to properly automate it. Don't be like me. One ingredient of the batteries is carbon fibre, made by smelting acrylic fibre, which is itself made by combining acrylonitrile, try saying that a couple times in a row, and water. These would have been very beneficial to have automated right now, but alas, mistakes were made that day. By combining caustic solution, chlorine and propene, we make ECH, which if we then combine with solvent and BPA gets us epoxy, an important ingredient in fiberglass, which is another high level material I could have done with properly automating right now rather than jury rigging. The other ingredient in fiberglass is glass fibre, which is made from hard glass. Hard glass is a whole beast of its own, but the most important ingredient is boric acid, which we get from a new volcanic gas separation recipe. The only difference between it and the old one is that it produces boric acid as well as the rest of the ingredients, so it should only really be used when you need some, as it can't be voided. The other checkpoint was for the tier 3 logistics buildings, where I need to build 40 inserter frees and 40 underground belt frees. So I quickly sort that out, and with that I can get back to doing some actual work while research continues in the background. The next science, physics research, is something of a mall check. Basically just requiring a load of tier 2 buildings, which no matter if I want you to know, you really should be automating. For this reason I'm starting a humongous mall to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. No effort is too great for this mall, as if done well it will greatly expedite my progress going forward. So I'm using all of the improved recipe for iron components, such as hydrochloric acid, for iron rods and plates. I also set up lubricant for wires and sheets. And then next up, I turn the iron into steel, which requires me to belt in some lime for the improved recipe I'm using. The improved steel rod and plate recipes require sulfuric acid rather than hydrochloric, so I get that set up in this little chemical area I have going. Aluminum rods and plates need caustic solution, but once that's all set up, all the major metal components are finished. Still under the illusion that the base will remain relatively neat, I set up this divide between belted production on the left and fully bought mall on the right. Before we get anywhere however, it's time to go back to that aluminum build from earlier and double it up like I said I would. It's easier said than done since there's a bit of a mess where I want to put it, but I can easily clean it up. Despite them only taking up half the square, placing them next to each other is quite an involved process, as alumina and an aluminum carbide both need to be pulled out of the middle to be used in other resources, and this necessitated some alterations to the design to draw equally from both setups. Ultimately it does at least appear to be functional, although it won't run at full pelt quite yet, as we aren't feeding in enough bauxite ore. There are a lot of random materials dotted around the factory that we're going to need in small amounts in the mall, and rather than belt those up to the mall, I'm going to give the whole base Roboport coverage, so I can just drop in and provide a chest at a random material I need. The first item I'm automating in the mall is capacitors, although it probably would have been better to belt automate them, as they're quite important. If I wanted to talk about every single thing in this mall, it'd take me all week. So all I'll say is that I'm generally aiming towards the tier 2 bots which I recently researched, whilst getting some convenient things along the way. Another thing I recently unlocked is a new chassis, which means an even larger equipment grid size, which for now I have nothing to fill with. A few items I need to automate require alkenes, be it ethylene, propene or benzene, and I realised I didn't actually have a setup anywhere which was putting them onto the fluid bus, so I quickly put one together. Just like in the plastic build, I'm using ethylene and propene pyrolysis to make sure neither back up, then burning off any excess benzene and venting excess methane. The core of a good setup in this mod is making sure that by no means can any byproducts back up. The old volcanic gas separation build was woefully insufficient for the amount of sulfur dioxide I was using, so I decided to build a new one. There are 2 volcanic gas separation recipes, both of which give the same amount of the same gases per unit of volcanic gas, but one giving us boric acid as well. Since boric acid can't be voided, the general idea is to just use the one that produces it until we have enough, and when we have too much, use the other recipe. I even added a circuit to dump sulfur dioxide while the boric acid wasn't full, although I think I expected to use far more than I actually ended up using. I also finally got around to automating solvent and epoxy with this quirky little build. The most important new thing I was producing, however, was circuits, which are used for higher tier modules and the next science pack. Anyway, with boric acid and epoxy, we are very close to fully automated fiberglass, so that's what I'm going to go for next. I start with a silica build, slightly overbuilding it because I figured I could just empty any extra into the logistics network to be used in the mall. Combining silica, boric acid, alumina and lime, we get hard glass, and we can then pass the hard glass into a foundry with water to make glass fibre. Combining epoxy and glass fibre gets us fiberglass, which, similar to circuits, is required in the next science, as well as just overall being quite useful. I get started on tier 2 bots finally here. When a tier 2 logistic bot is placed into the robot replacer requester chest, an idle tier 1 logistic bot will fly over and change places with it, meaning that over time, all of the old logistics bots will be emptied out of the system. This is especially convenient because the tier 2 bots take a tier 1 bot as part of the recipe, so the collected bot can be used to craft another tier 2 bot. In the background, I had copy-pasted another of these massive air separation builds, but neglected to retrofit it for the new air separation recipe, since we're going to start to need a lot of argon soon, so I decided to just build an entire new one right next to it. I explained how this recipe worked earlier, so this is just the same but like on a larger scale. I get to work on this new material called ceramic powder, which needs silicon, graphite and boron, and has uses in many recipes, including circuits which I briefly mentioned earlier. You will notice I said boron and not boric acid, because we have to smelt the boric acid first, which gives us the pure boron. I wish I could show you when and where I was smelting the boron, but I literally cannot find it, so I can only assume it was more paused OBS shenanigans. Tier 2 sensors are up next, but they need titanium tetrachloride, and rather than run a pipe all the way from here to the mall, I opt to barrel it up and have bots ferry it over. I also put together a new explosive recipe by combining nitric acid, glycerin and a few solid ingredients to make good old nitroglycerin. Nitric acid is made using ammonia and oxygen. To make sensor 2s we need to use a nanofabricator, a new building you might have noticed me using for the circuits, which is used to craft things which need absolute precision. Sensor 2s gave us access to scout drones, which can be launched out of one of these drone launchers to scout faraway areas. Here's one in action. They're especially useful in this mod because the radars are really bad for exploring new areas, mostly only useful for keeping an eye on your existing base. I wait for a dozen or so to craft up, and then rain hell on the undiscovered world. You get a pretty good view of the entire map so far here, and you can see how much this new base absolutely dwarfs the old one. My next goal is getting all of the buildings ready for physics research, which basically just means expanding this mall massively, as buildings from all walks are required to craft it. It might seem expensive for a single craft of science, but it gives us 25 boxes of physics research, which makes 125 unboxed packs. We're going to talk more about boxing when we get around to fully utilising it, but in most cases it's a flat 400% boost to the throughput for little cost. There are a lot of buildings and intermediates in Nullius, usually taking 3 or 4 ingredients each, which is why I never bothered with a belted mall, but even using bots the size of the mall grows quickly. I'll try to put up the crafting tree for tier 2 labs, although it was far too big for the website I used to show it well. A single ingredient of physics science this is, by the way. For the next few hours of footage are mostly me just expanding this mall, so we'll be skipping through a lot of it to the interesting bits. I eventually research a new tier of beacons and place them down out here to complete a research checkpoint. The small beacon 2 can take 2 modules and transmits its effect over a small area, and the large beacon 1 can take 1 module and transmit its effect over a large area, but cannot be in the range of another large beacon, and also reduces the effectiveness of small beacons in its range. Both of these are useful in their own way. I also put this tier 2 lab I was talking about earlier to use, since these tier 1 labs weren't actually able to keep up with the amount of science we were producing. For physics research, we're going to need Stirling Engine 2s, for which we need to make the tier 2 heat pipes and storage tanks, for which we need eutectic salt, requiring nitric acid, limestone and soda ash. This is a good time to further introduce boxing, as thermal tank 2s require boxed eutectic salt. Boxing is completely free in an assembler, only requiring an amount, usually about 20 of the item, and giving you 4 boxes of it, which might be used in recipes like this, or can be turned back into the ingredient elsewhere. In this case, the tank needs 3 boxes of the salt, which translates to 15 of the unboxed item. Despite physics research being quite far away, I still placed the assemblers down ready for it. Due to the density of boxed recipes, we only need 4 large assemblers to keep up with the 120 science per minute target I've been aiming for. Next to it, we set up solar power towers, which unlike their smaller cousins are an insane source of power. The gist is that the tower stands in the middle of a field of reflective heliostat mirrors, which focus the sun onto a single point. Then the heat from the pure beam of solar power can be extracted and used to generate power. Both the towers and the mirrors are a little bit expensive, but once placed, they produce a peak of 100 megawatts of power and an average across an entire day cycle of 70 megawatts. I get started building one, but it'll be a while before I get the required 550 heliostat mirrors to fully utilise this tower. I also finished researching the Mechaling, a mini Spidertron which, in retrospect, really isn't that great, but has its uses. It's very slow and has quite a small inventory, but honestly, I just kept using it for the novelty. I recently unlocked a new process for voiding chlorine, which is a lot easier and more expandable than the old one, involving dissolving crushed limestone in hydrochloric acid to make calcium chloride, which I mentioned earlier, and which can be easily voided. I also recently got water fill, which just takes concrete, explosives and a lot of saline water, and allows me to place these shallow water pools wherever I want to void fluids anywhere. I ended up expanding it a lot further, as since I'd turned on all the science, the caustic solution tank had very slowly been draining due to backed up chlorine, and I needed to fill it back up as fast as possible, since until I do, barely any sodium hydroxide is getting out for use in chemical science. With physics science close at hand, I wanted to get started on my 4th base of the playthrough, this time making use of compressed gas and boxed items. The first thing I wanted to make was my pure water electrolysis, but I had seen that using steam electrolysis was a bit more energy efficient, so I decided to go with that. The thing about boiling water is that you need heat to do it, so I decided to lay down another solar tower to get the necessary heat. With this heat, I can then boil fresh water pumped out of the ground and dump any of the wastewater produced out of the outfalls to the left. For both water and steam electrolysis, there is a pressurised and a non-pressurised version, so naturally we're going with the pressurised version for throughput, and also for the reason that it just magically gives you more hydrogen per input than the non-pressurised version for some reason. You can tell that a gas is in its compressed form, as it has this more fluid drop shape rather than the gas mark shape it had earlier. I can then move on to the pressurised improved air separation build, By this point, I'm basically only using tier 2 buildings, as most of them I had to produce anyway for physics science. You'll also notice I'm using the new tier 3 pipes, which are made out of fiberglass and can carry 80% pressure rather than the 60% of the tier 2 pipes. The only problem with using pressurized air separation is that, to my knowledge, there is no way to create compressed air directly from the atmosphere, so we have to pass normal air through these compressors before it reaches the distilleries. I really don't know why they need to be so loud. The general structure for this base is going to be as follows. Trains will bring in any bulk materials such as iron ore, process them at scale making use of boxes the entire way, and then from there all solid materials will be moved around by bots, and any fluids will be moved onto a fluid bus. I'll talk more about this in the next part, but the stupidly long recipe chains in this mod mean that putting productivity modules into everything results in easily like 200% gains on some crafting chains. So although bots sound like they won't keep up, I believe with the combination of this and boxing, they will. This area you've just watched me fill in here is where the trains are going to drop off materials for the base. Quickly, before I continue with the base, this is what a full solar tower field looks like. Pretty cool, right? For some absolutely lobotomite reason, I decided to put the train depot well out the way of my base. Rather than the hydrogen canisters I used to fuel the trains last time, I'm using batteries now, which only need an electrolyzer to refill them. However, it means that bots need to deliver top-up batteries all the way out here, which is, suffice to say, a massive waste of time. We also here have the debut of tier 2 trains. I get started on an iron mine connected to a train system and make use of these new boxer buildings, which are tiny, compact ways to box items quickly. You don't even need to pick the recipe, just drop in the items and it packs them. Despite being 5 times as dense in theory, boxes only allow you to fit twice as much ore in a train, as they only stack to 20, which is equivalent to 100 of the material itself. This is an issue that bots and belts don't suffer from. What we really want is limestone, however, for, as always, I need to get caustic solution set up before I can do anything else. Now that I have access to water fill, which I should say I did not choose to have, but was part of the mod pack, setting up anything to do with seawater is much easier. From there, it's just a simple caustic solution build like any of the other ones, except I'm boxing all of the excess sodium hydroxide to be taken elsewhere. To neutralise the chlorine, we're of course using limestone. We can talk about the new boxed recipes here, as instead of having to unbox the materials at their destination, the mod actually gives us some boxed versions of recipes, which work exactly the same as the unboxed version, just all of the ingredients and products are boxed, and it takes longer to make up for the increased throughput. In this case, when we crushed boxed limestone, we get boxed crushed limestone and boxed stone. To neutralise excess chlorine, we're using the calcium chloride recipe, which also has a boxed version, allowing us to input boxed crushed limestone. The amount of fluids is also increased by a factor of 5, so that the recipe is ratioed exactly the same as the normal recipe. Of course, when we crushed the limestone, we also created stone boxes, which we're disposing of using the old mineral dust method. With caustic solution now flowing, I can get started on iron. My target for the setup is a belt of boxed iron ingots, equal to 5 belts of unboxed ingots, although I can easily increase this later on by just dropping in the next tier of buildings once I have them unlocked. Before I finished the setup, however, I realised I've forgotten to set up graphite, so I quickly go and do that. Boxed smelting recipes can only be done in these large furnaces, and thanks to their fast crafting speed, as well as the general efficiency of the boxed recipes, these 4 furnaces will give us a whole belt of boxed graphite. It does, however, need compressed methane rather than the regular stuff, but thankfully we've been given a recipe which turns compressed hydrogen and carbon dioxide directly into compressed methane. Whilst I was here, I realised that all this solar boiling business was more effort than it was worth, and wasn't giving me very good throughput, so I decided instead to just go with good old freshwater filtration. Back over at the iron smelting, I just had to plug the graphite, crushed limestone and crushed iron into this stack of large furnaces to get a steady belt of iron ingot boxes. If you were wondering what would happen if a recipe required uncompressed gas, but all I had was compressed gas, well, a barrel pump can be used to decompress the compressed gas, like in this lime recycling setup here. I got to work making some boxed iron components, but quickly realised I didn't have any lubricant for the wiring sheets. So I went to rectify that, but quickly realised I didn't have any silicon for the lubricant. Oops. Now of course, I need to go connect a sandstone patch to my rail network. The silicon build is just the same as last time, except obviously boxed and using the normal silica recipe rather than the daft one I used. I'm not going to bother belting it over to the lubricant, simply using robots to carry it over will suffice. And what do you know? We use the boxed lubricant recipe, which allows me to turn the silicon boxes directly into lubricant. With the lubricant, we can now finish this little component area and move on. The next natural step is to sort out aluminium, so I build northwest to an area where there is a bauxite patch and 2 fumarole fields right next to each other, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. I lay down the usual system to turn bauxite into alumina, but from here, the recipe diverges from what we are used to. Essentially, rather than smelting the alumina, we instead electrolyse it with eutectic salt to give us aluminum ingots and oxygen. We would, if I had the recipe anywhere. As it turns out, I had blindly followed Factory Planner without realising I hadn't researched the recipe I was using, so now I need to wait like 5 hours before I can even turn it on. Only slightly shaken by this misstep, I move on to another important resource, plastic. We yet again have a new plastic recipe at our disposal, this time being cross-linked polyethylene, or PEX for short. Immediately seeing this recipe, it might seem a bit expensive, requiring silicon and aluminum powder, as well as a lot of ethylene and hydrogen chloride, before you realise that it gives 9 boxes of plastic per craft. 9. That's 45 plastic bars. Plus, getting rid of some more chlorine for free never hurt anybody. The only actual issue is due to me messing up the aluminum build, meaning that for now, we're going to have to import the aluminum from the old base to keep this going. I quickly threw together an alkene synthesis build, but it's not really worth talking about in detail, considering that I've done it twice before, and it's just the same now except with pressurised recipes. Originally, I wanted to finish this episode once I'd set up all of the basic materials in the new base, but I thought it might be a bit more interesting if I were to instead get started on something entirely new. Providing I haven't already changed my mind on the title, attention payers among you will know where this is going. I started here by producing glycerol, made by combining ECH, hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide. Combining glycerol and oxygen in a nanofabricator produces sugar, which is an important building block of life. This is a poor way of producing sugar, since it's basically implied the machine is fabricating sugar molecules individually, but it's meant to be, since we are literally bootstrapping life from scratch. Our goal right now is to start producing biochemistry research packs, which take the 4 pillars of life in this mod: sugar, amino acids, fatty acids and nucleotides, as well as some chemistry and electrical research for good measure. The biological research packs are not like a new tier of science pack, but instead like their own tech tree in parallel to the main one, and gated by certain technologies from the main tech tree. Amino acids are relatively simple, but incredibly slow to make, taking a combination of ammonia, oxygen and glycerol, but taking 8 seconds to produce a single unit. For reference, we need 1100 for a single biochemistry research pack, meaning it would take a single nanofabricator 7 hours and 20 minutes to make enough for the 3 packs required just for the first research. I only built 1 at this moment, but quickly realised many more will be needed. Methanol, oxygen and propene get us fatty acids, and although they are still very slow, they are the chemical I had the least problem with. Finally, sugar, methanol, nitric acid and amino acids give us nucleotides, the final chemical we need for biochemistry research. Biological research requires a new type of lab, the biology laboratory. It's a bit bigger than a normal lab and takes a lot more power, but most importantly of all, it gives us 4 module slots to fill up with productivity modules. Whilst waiting for the 3 biochemistry packs to craft, I get all of my ducks in order in the old base, including building a whole new solar tower field to make sure I stay ahead on power. Like I said earlier, I was immediately experiencing that the amino acid production was insufficient, so I expanded it out a bit further. After a long wait, I get the 3 biochemistry packs for the first biology research, which is going to allow us to create our first living thing once it finishes researching. Once it is researched, we can combine a canister, some chemical and physical science, and nucleotides to create a bacteria genome, the DNA of a small bacterial organism from which we can create living bacteria. To create the bacteria themselves, we first need to create protocells to put the DNA into. We then combine the genome, protocells, and some other biological chemicals to create living bacteria. Now, to start breeding these bacteria, we need to feed them cellulose, which is another material we need to make in a poor way, but will unlock a much better biological way to create later. I made this solvent build, and by combining it with sugar in a nanofabricator, we get cellulose. Once we have produced enough bacteria from the genomes, breeding more is as simple as giving them seawater, sugar, cellulose, and mineral dust. A neat detail is that bacteria is actually a fluid, so we'll use an overflow valve to make sure there is always enough bacteria in the system to get put back into the process. You might notice in the top right corner that I'm already researching the next biology research. This new research gives us access to the algae genome, which, as the name suggests, is going to allow us to start producing algae. Using algae genomes, we can start producing algae progenitors, from which we can finally produce the algae itself. To create the algae from the progenitor, we provide it with mineral dust, seawater, and air, and it reproduces into 2 new algae. Once we create enough algae this way, we will be able to breed them using the same ingredients. Algae can be crushed down into algae spores and cellulose, and by combining the algae spores with those same 3 ingredients as the progenitors, we get even more algae, which we can then crush down into more spores to make more algae to make more spores. You get the idea. You might have noticed the important detail there. Crushing the algae into spores also produces cellulose, meaning we now have a way to produce cellulose without having to use that terrible recipe from earlier, making it much easier to feed the bacteria. And it's a good job too, as the next tier of biological science, microbiology research, requires 200 bacteria, 100 algae, and an algae progenitor. The mall is the heart of the factory. Every building, pipe, belt, inserter comes from the mall, if you want a dirty handcrafting heretic anyway. But what if the factory was the mall? The tools we are given in Nullius, such as extensive crafting chains which benefit greatly from productivity, boxed items and recipes, multiple tiers of bots as well as a dozen tiers of upgrades for them, and some extremely efficient science recipes we're going to be getting into as the episode progresses, lend themselves to the mother of all bot bases. I immediately begin with polycrystalline silicon, for reasons I don't really remember. I'm sure I had some good reason or another, but it's beyond me at the present. The important bits anyway are the yield modules, which, if you don't remember from earlier, are like productivity modules, but cost more power and speed, and give a bit more productivity. Productivity is everything in this base, and although at the moment with my tier 2 buildings and productivity modules, I only get 10% productivity per recipe, essentially a 10% boost to output. If every step in a 7 item long chain had that productivity boost, that will already double the output from the same amount of input materials. Suffice to say, the recipe chains will get much longer than 7 items, and the productivity bonus is much greater by the end of the video. To offset the loss in crafting speed from these modules, I'm going to be covering the whole area in these large beacons. Just like that, we're producing polycrystalline silicon. For those of you concerned that a bot base doesn't exactly seem like the most interesting concept, that's because it isn't. I won't be focusing too much on this bit of a mod, to be honest with you, as at this point the terraforming and life seeding is the important bit, and all this is just a means to an end, although I will update when anything interesting comes to fruition. While I'm here, I get the first 2 science packs set back up, since they're pretty simple and just use stuff that the new base is already producing anyway. Working towards the mechanical research pack, I realised that the boxed tier 1 mortar recipe is different to the unboxed one and needs insulated wire, so we're going to need to get rubber set up before we can really get anywhere. Unlike our problem with the mortars, however, boxed rubber is the exact same as unboxed rubber, just with the values changed, so I won't be re-explaining that process. Going forward here, if I make any recipes I've done before, we'll just skip over it for the sake of brevity, and to save some brain space for the new stuff. I also do steel while I'm at it, since we're going to need it at some point. You'll remember that the steel plate and rod recipes need sulfuric acid, so we're going to need to set up a proper robust volcanic gas separation build. Even though we don't need boric acid yet, I make sure that from the get-go, the production line is able to balance it, switching to a recipe which doesn't produce it when there is enough in the chest. I also got aluminum component foundries ready for when the new aluminum recipe finishes researching, so I can just set the electrolyzers and let it rip. Although, I had managed to forget to place pipes to remove the oxygen from them, so it wasn't as simple as I might have liked it to be. We're midway through researching a new mechanical research recipe, which is ridiculously more efficient than the old one, but takes much more advanced resources. Specifically, it turns 3 steel wire boxes and a tier 3 pump box into 25 boxes of mechanical research. That's pretty good, I think. And even if by direct comparison it might be a bit more expensive, can't really be bothered to check, the productivity from the extra steps almost certainly makes it cheaper. It does mean, however, we need to make tier 3 pumps, which is its own whole can of worms, starting with these tier 2 motors I've been building in the background. The worst bit of making tier 3 pumps is making tier 3 motors, which are going to need epoxy, as well as just a load of other materials. Epoxy is the important one, however, as it can't just be botted together, it needs actual thought, which begins here where I make a small solvent build. I've just sort of shoved it under the briny electrolysis area, so it needs to be sort of spread out to avoid the pipes running through. Skipping a lot of steps here, as it's all previously been explored, I get an epoxy build put together, which is opening us up to both pump tier 3s and fiberglass, which is needed in a lot of the higher tier buildings. For the final time now, I feel the need to acknowledge that I'm skipping massive amounts of work here. If you felt like you were missing out on something, here's a time lapse of what I was doing. Literal hours of mall building. Unfortunately, a victim of my admittedly convenient bot base is that it's approximately as fun to watch build as watching paint dry. When I get to the biology and terraforming, then we can slow down and enjoy the ride. Something else incredibly useful tier 3 pumps unlocked for us was tier 3 wind power, which is a 3 times power boost from the tier 2 turbines, but unfortunately has the same downfall as its predecessors. It's incredibly unreliable. For this reason, I start to trial ways to store power rather than just tanking the downtime like I have been so far, starting with a steam battery. Unfortunately, as I discover, boilers cannot be set to surge, meaning they'll always try to pull power, and therefore aren't really suitable for storing it. My next idea for power storage is a compressed gas storage and decompression facility. This is basically a more thought out version of the nitrogen battery from the starter base. I compress a common gas using surplus power, and when there is a dip in power, decompress it through a closed turbine to reclaim some of that power. My initial plan was to use nitrogen, but I realised I had a load of oxygen just being vented away from the algae farm, so I decided to use that instead. You will notice, I didn't actually leave any tanks for the uncompressed gas, so until I fix that later on, the turbines will just back up when it decompresses, there's nowhere for that gas to go. As it turns out, placing turbines while you're in a Spidertron is an absolute jankfest. The turbine's airspace, the area around it in which you can't place other turbines, is not something the player can usually collide with. Despite this, when placing or upgrading a turbine, it seems to cause the Spidertron to recalculate its footing, causing the poor little guy to trip the fuck out whenever we place one. Just look at him go. With my power only slightly stabilised, it's time to start spending it. I waste a massive amount of resources with these moduleless assemblers, so I set to upgrade them out to tier 2 and get some yield modules into them. I start to set up the science drop-offs from the bot base, but at the moment, I'm just letting the old base keep providing most of it, since that's basically all it's going to be good for soon, especially as more and more intermediates are taken over by the bot base. We just finished a new research, which is going to allow us to separate trace gas from residual gas separation further into helium, volcanic gas and methane. Volcanic gas and methane are moderately useful, I suppose, but helium is the real important resource. It's going to be used in a multitude of important items, from higher tier heat pipes and Stirling engines, to circuits, to even a type of nuclear fuel once we get around to that later. It is an incredibly important resource, and is literally made out of thin air. We tank up the helium so we can pass a production checkpoint, research, connect the methane to the bus, and just void the volcanic gas because nobody cares about it. Back at the bot area, I set up tier 2 logistic bots, since the mall was struggling to replace all the tier 1s. Talking about bots, my character itself is an android, so I don't see any reason why there can't be more than one of me. I produce a second body, but when placing it down I can't quite seem to transfer my consciousness to it. I do some academic research into why this is, but can't see any reason. The problem in the end was that, despite the android body literally taking a chassis to craft, I need to put another one in it to actually pilot it. Once I've done that, I can swap between the bodies to my heart's content. It sounds really useful, in theory, but in the end, the only use I have for it is to have a body to store all of the 24 or so artillery remotes this mod has later on. Once again, I am a victim of forgetting to unpause OBS. What I was doing while it was paused was building this lithium build. Basically, we process a massive amount of brine to extract a small amount of lithium chloride, and then we can electrolyse the lithium chloride to create lithium and chlorine. Processing all of that brine creates silly amounts of salt, but we can just combine any overflow with fresh water to make seawater, and then void the seawater. This lithium can then be used in a nanofabricator, along with a few other resources to make tier 2 batteries, used in a lot of advanced buildings later on. I quickly run around and set up some barreling pumps, as I'm currently researching an improved chemical research recipe, which requires a few barreled fluids. With no confidence in my gas battery, I start working on an accumulator field here instead, because although it's expensive, it's dead simple. Finally, the mod has judged that we've trudged through enough regular science to get back to some biology, so I'm researching botany, which is going to give us access to grass. I stir into action soon before the research finishes, as there are a few things I need to set up to begin actually growing grass. You see, by combining ammonia, nitric acid, sludge, algae and cellulose, we can get fertiliser, a key ingredient in growing grass. Completely incapable of doing just one thing at a time, I then run over and set up grass genomes, since we're going to need them to make the first grass. It takes nucleotides, bacteria, algae genomes and geology research, spitting out grass genomes and wastewater. You can see here I'm starting to connect all of my wastewater to a central waste pipe, rather than dealing with it locally. There is a good reason for this, we're going to get around to later. I also start making grass progenitors, the next step in our bootstrapped grass, as well as an ingredient of the botanical research pack, which takes sugar, cellulose, algae genomes, protocells, amino acids and fatty acids, as well as spitting out more wastewater. Finally, I get back to the fertiliser. It still needs sludge, which isn't something I'm used to needing to actually produce. Initially, my idea is to split wastewater into sludge and seawater, and then just punt the seawater out with an outflow to leave only the sludge. Although this is not the grand purpose of wastewater I was alluding to a moment ago. We also need brown landfill to grow grass, effectively acting as the dirt we grow it in. We can get brown landfill by combining grey and tan landfill, both made by mixing different amounts of gravel and sand, and some more sludge. This is another thing about this mod that I love. Byproducts were previously seen as completely useless or a means to an end, coming back around and being used in key, important production chains. We've seen it with nitrogen earlier, sludge now, and as I've said we're going to see it a bit later with wastewater. Almost nothing in the mod doesn't serve multiple purposes, and whilst by no means is this mod perfect, it certainly gives the impression it's been incredibly well thought out. Now for the balanced criticism, there's so many damn items in this mod I get lost looking through my inventory. Anyway, so with grass progenitors, brown landfill, fresh water and air, we can actually start producing grass. Similar to algae, we need to process the grass into seeds before we can turn it into more grass. This is done by combining the grass with water in a tier 3 crusher, which in turn gives us grass seeds along with cellulose and sludge. The sludge can get put back into the system to be used up, the cellulose we make available to the logistic network to be used elsewhere, and the grass seeds we will take over to the setup where we're actually going to grow the grass. Talking about growing grass, it's done in these hydro plants by combining grass seeds, fertiliser, brown landfill, air and fresh water, giving us grass, oxygen and sludge in return. Once that's all hooked up, we get our first naturally produced grass. Well, as natural as it gets anyway, which we then need to hook back up to that grass crusher. I don't hook up the other hydro plants just yet, although I do get them ready, because with so few seeds in the system, they might get spread so thinly between them that none of them actually have enough to grow more grass. But as the process picks up, I'll connect them up. We also have the possibility now of an overflow of sludge in the system, so I set up a hydro plant which will void it in that case, so that nothing backs up. See again here, me getting hopelessly lost, looking through my inventory, even after 100 hours in this mod. I get my eyes set on the prize of our efforts here, a way to make sugar naturally by milling grass seeds. To research it though, we're going to need to set up botanical research, meaning it's time to put this grass to use. The research pack itself needs a grass progenitor, a lot of grass, and a lot of boxes of cellulose. There is a common theme among the biology research packs from here on out, where they take a progenitor of the organism, a load of the organism itself, and then something the organism produces a lot of. What we're mostly waiting on is for the grass seeds to back up, so we stop consuming grass making them, and some can be spared in the science production. Whilst I wait, I do prepare where we will mill the grass seeds. Essentially, I want them to only be milled when there is enough grass in the box to continue producing science, so our sugar production isn't jeopardising our science production, as it takes minutes to make a single science pack as it is. Also, we're in a position now where we make more cellulose than we consume, which will only get worse when grass seed milling comes online, as that also produces cellulose, so I need to set up a system to burn any extra. This has the added benefit of producing some graphite for us. Finally, we've gotten to the point where some grass is finding its way to the science assembler, and not too long after, the first science pack finishes, as well as a second beginning to produce right after. I've already got my eyes on the next organism, worms, but we have a few more regular researches to wrestle through before we get to those. As soon as I have enough science packs, I start researching grass seed milling. The existing sugar build is a massive drain on resources, and still isn't really enough, so the sooner I can get rid of it, the better. The moment the research is finished, I'm straight on building the setup. We don't even need much production, just 2 crushers will give us far more than enough sugar for basically free compared to what we were doing before. I also got a better cellulose burning recipe, so I jump straight on that too. I waste no time ripping up the old sugar build. Up to this point, I have been making titanium in my mall in a little build I didn't think was notable enough to talk about, but it's becoming woefully insufficient for my needs, so it's time to put a proper build together, starting out with planning it in Hellmod. Initially, I planned for a yellow belt of the unboxed stuff, so 1/5 of a yellow belt of boxed titanium ingots. The only resources I need shipping in for this new titanium recipe are limestone and sandstone, which we can share a single Cybersyn train station drop-off by using filtered loaders. Starting with processing the limestone first, we need to begin by crushing it into crushed limestone, the stone byproduct of which we can just ship off to join all the other stone byproducts from the other processes. I returned to find that when I added the 2 new loaders to the sandstone side, I had forgotten to give them a filter, meaning I have to fix that and then dump the misplaced limestone over to the right warehouse by hand. Anyway, so by combining the crushed limestone with hydrochloric acid, we get liquid calcium chloride, which we then dehydrate into its solid form in these distilleries. The calcium chloride is then electrolyzed into calcium and chlorine, the latter we can just send off to be voided. That is the extent of the limestone side for now. We need to process the sandstone next. The first step is crushing a lot of sandstone into a lot of sand and stone. The stone byproduct again just being sent away, and the sand being combined with sulfuric acid to create our old friend rutile. The next step is to combine the rutile, calcium chloride and calcium in large furnaces to create titanium ingots, lime and more chlorine. It's nothing but a mistake to give me Bob's inserters. Pickled titanium components need nitric acid, so we get those set up, and that's basically our titanium issues sorted for now and forever. The next important research which finishes is the one for wormies. I'm not going to explain how the worm genomes and progenitors are made, since it is so similar to the other times we've done it. The difference being now, we need a chemical called oil, which is made by combining fatty acids and glycerol. Now, wormies are the first fauna we've created on this planet, so it follows that rather than producing oxygen, they require it. Furthermore, worms feed on waste, meaning we also need to provide them with sludge to reproduce. Overall, the recipe to turn worm eggs into a real worm is by combining worm eggs with sand, grass, oxygen and sludge, which gives us more worm eggs, worms and carbon dioxide. Whilst we wait for enough worm eggs to produce from the bootstrap recipe to kickstart the process for real, another research finishes which immediately pulls my attention. You see, that sacred purpose for wastewater I had been alluding to up to now has come to fruition, as it is actually a key source of an incredibly important chemical, heavy water. We'll talk about heavy water more in a moment after we've discussed how it's made. Almost all of the wastewater byproduct in the base is being pushed to this one tank near the end of the bus, from which we can pull it up here to be separated into heavy water, sludge, and a metric ton of saline water. It is of course only the heavy water we care about, so the other two can be flushed away. For the moment, however, the purpose of the heavy water is going to remain a mystery, as enough wormies have accumulated that we can start breeding them properly. Since worms and eggs are both produced equally, we need some way to get rid of them, and that way is, well, we can just connect the worm shake up to the sludge pipes to be fed back into its ancestors. Of course, a worm's true purpose is to be bottled up with one of its progenitors in pure carbon dioxide and shipped off to be zapped in a lab. And what can I say? My hands are tied and that is what I must do. With the wormy processing line functional and running at full pelt, I have a new item to start producing, red circuits. It's not really that interesting except for the fact that it's now our first use of helium. Our first research with wormy research packs, nematology research if you're a nerd, finishes, which gives us some funky ways to process worms and then turn them into amino acids and some other useless stuff. Wonder what's going on in here? Well, I like to think they're squeezing the amino acids out of them like this. With us getting amino acids from worms now, we can get rid of a massive nanofabricator build for that too. Even better, if we crush worm eggs with a bit of solvent, we get nucleotides as well as more amino acids, meaning the only pillar of life we still need to nanofabricate is fatty acids. I mentioned a new chemical research recipe earlier, but couldn't find the bit of footage where I built it, very possibly lost from OBS being paused. So here is where I actually built the thing. We also just knocked a new tier of modules, so I spend a bit of time setting them up in the bot base. I realised now how daft it was to be wasting my precious wastewater to make sludge for the biology area, so instead I decide to melt mineral dust with sulfuric acid to make the sludge needed. Finally, the purpose of heavy water reveals itself. Heavy water is a slight misnomer, as it actually appears to be a mixture of heavy water and super heavy water, and by electrolysing this mixture we break it down into its constituent parts: oxygen, deuterium and tritium. Tritium and deuterium are incredibly important resources, as if you bash them together hard enough, each pair that fuse release a helium atom, a neutron, and a tasty 17.1 mega electron volts of energy. That is to say, a lot of energy from not a lot of material. We don't quite have the equipment yet to make use of this new energy source, but deuterium and tritium are hard to come by, so I'd like to start stockpiling them now. I've just recently unlocked tier 3 robotics, so I get the robot frames set up in the mall for when my research finishes for the logistic bots themselves, and when the bots are ready, I get this little thing placed down to slowly replace all of the tier 2 bots. With our biology research, we unlock our first recipe that includes a non-biological material, that being textiles. By adding cellulose into the mix, our textile recipe becomes much more efficient, and I look forward to more improved recipes in the future. After all this time, some of the materials in the old base are running dry, so I've started placing boxes which request boxed materials from the new base, and make them available to the old base in their unboxed form. But one does start to wonder, if we're producing algae in a facility using the very air and water we're pulling directly from the environment, then why not cut out the middleman? Why not seed algae on the surface of the planet? Well, that's exactly what the algaculture drone is for. For the low cost of an algae progenitor, a scout drone, bacteria barrels, and a lot of algae spores, and some mineral dust, we can launch our very own algae colonies into nearby water sources, beginning the conversion of this barren planet into a lush utopia. Very soon our first drone is produced. All that's left to do now is launch it. And ooh, what's this? This, people, is quite literally what we were put on this planet for. We have a list of objectives, all to do with terraforming, and not until every single one of these is completed will we see the victory screen. If you look on the left, you'll see that one algaculture drone advanced the algae condition by 1.05%, meaning we're going to launch about 100 of these to get it done, which itself is only one of the 13 items on the list. I immediately get to work launching more and more algaculture drones, not just to finish the algae goal, but also because as we release more and more plants into the wild, and they can photosynthesize in the open air, it will slowly begin passively increasing the oxygen goal too. It's not long until every body of water within range of my drone launcher is stuffed to the gills with algae, so I build an artillery train to take the drones farther afield. I first launch a barrage of scout drones to actually locate the bodies of water, and then follow up with the algaculture drones. Algae prefers the shallower water near the coast, so I'm basically out here doing a connect the dots with the borders of the lakes. The process begins anew at a different point on the train network, and with us already at nearly 80% on the algae goal, I was hoping this would finish the goal, but unfortunately we were just barely short and didn't have enough drones on board. I return with a vengeance, and just like that, terraforming goal 1 of 13 is complete. At our mall, I get nuclear reactors set up. There is not so long left now until we're going to be able to make use of these. More importantly, however, we've just unlocked trees, so it's time to start up that whole process, beginning of course with the genomes and progenitors. I waste no time getting started with the bootstrap tree recipe. I can build the actual farming setup whilst I wait for this to do its thing. Oh, I cannot do that, and instead go build a fusion cell setup. Taking just a canister, tritium and deuterium, they look quite cheap really, but might I remind you that tritium is worth 40,000 times its weight in gold. Just a few units of the stuff takes a whole lot of wastewater processing. Each one of these cells holds 3 gigajoules of energy, which would satiate the current power consumption of my base for like 2 or 3 seconds. But once you begin to consider the neighbour bonus of reactors, the efficiency increases quite a lot. Back to the trees then. If you want to turn a tree seed into a tree, you need to feed it a stable diet of wormies, tan landfill, fertiliser, fresh water and air, as well as it's going to spit out a bit of sludge and oxygen. For trees themselves, we just toss into a wood chipper, which gives us tree seeds, wood, wood chips and sludge. Once we have our wormingtons and the rest belted in, we can begin very slowly producing trees. Trees are the highest form of plant life we're going to seed on the planet, so they do take quite a while to grow. In retrospect, if I was being smart, I would have made a much larger setup for these guys. I paused OBS, and upon unpausing, I was coming close to finishing this nuclear reactor. I'm going to be honest, boiling water is very unnecessary when Stirling engines exist, but for some reason, I could be bothered to build this whole thing, but not set up a single assembler for tier 3 Stirling engines, so this is what we're stuck with for now. It's built using closed turbines, meaning most of the steam which is used up is condensed back into water, but I still need to build this water purification setup to top up what is lost. Given how precious tritium is, I don't want to waste it, so I get to work figuring out how to only insert fuel when the heat drops. The idea is that a fuel cell is only inserted when a used cell is removed from the reactor, and empty cells are only removed when a specific condition is met, so that when the reactor temperature drops below a certain threshold, fuel is inserted one at a time until it gets back above that threshold, hopefully wasting no heat to a reactor that's already at its capacity. The hard bit is of course figuring out how to measure the reactor's temperature, which this thing with tier 1 heat pipes does poorly, so I'm better off finding a different way. Whilst considering my options, I set up a way to empty the used fuel cells. Like I mentioned earlier, tritium-deuterium fusion creates helium, so we have some of that come out, as well as wastewater to empty, giving us back the canister half of the time. The reactors themselves seem to be working well. I just need to spend some time improving water flow, as it's causing some turbines to back up. In the end, the answer for controlling the reactor is simpler than I could have imagined. As you see, the Nullius Maximus Modpack includes the inventory sensor mod, which, when placed next to a heat tank, will tell you its temperature, and using this information, we just remove fuel when the temperature is less than 1000 degrees. We get a new electrical research recipe unlocked, which takes red circuits, tier 2 batteries, and tier 2 sensors, producing a lot of electrical research boxes. Again, I don't really know if it's materially cheaper, but it's certainly more convenient. With those fusion cells we've been producing, we can also start making nuclear bombs. I probably won't be using them much on their own, but they're an important part of some of the terraforming drones we'll soon be making use of. Here's a bit of nuking though, because of course I couldn't resist. I ultimately realised that between power and all these bombs, my tritium stores would take a nosedive, so my next plan was to try to up production. Most of my wastewater in the base was already going to heavy water, but what if I started producing some for the singular purpose of producing the heavy water? It's quite simple really. Use seawater separation to create saline and wastewater, and then dump the saline water whilst keeping the wastewater, to be separated further into more saline water, heavy water, and sludge. Again, voiding the saline water, but turning the sludge into more wastewater to be fed back into the system. Then, for good measure, I made another one. You might have remembered whilst I was doing all of this, that what I was meant to be doing was sorting out trees, so I get back around to doing that. Dendrology research, the study of trees, required the usual suspects for biology research. The organism, being 80 trees, a progenitor, so a tree progenitor, and then something the organism produces a lot of, so 200 boxes of wood. Somehow, crush all of that together into a conical flask, which surely must create one of the densest fluids in the universe given how much we're putting into that little thing, and it gets zapped in a dome to release truths about life, the universe, and trees. Now, we need to find something to do with all the excess wood we're going to make. So my plan is to crush any excess wood we have into wood chips, and then if we have too many wood chips, to turn them into graphite, which should hopefully balance out the system. We're entering into an era now where biological technologies actually require more than a dozen packs per research, and therefore this tiny science setup no longer well serves our purpose. I replace it instead with this larger setup, which should work for us for most of the rest of the run. Also around now, the technology finishes researching to allow us to craft rocket fuel, and having clearly surpassed any care in the world for order and organisation, I just dump the build into the middle of what should have been my fluid bus. It works of course, but it's not what I'd like to call an elegant solution. Amusingly here, I tried to put a blue belt box into a module insert slot by accident and it crashed the game. Feeling like it comes around faster every time, our next organism presents itself, fish. Again, we begin with genomes and progenitors, and then we start putting together the farm. The humble fish lives on a diet of algae, worms, seawater and oxygen, and is rich in oils we may find useful. Before I do finish my business with the fishies, however, a research checkpoint necessitates that I launch a deep excavation drone. Make no mistake of what this is. It's a barrel packed to its gills with nuclear weapons, and it leaves a hole befitting of the concept. So, fish, yeah. Before we can really get anywhere, we need to get a few eggs made using the bootstrap recipe, so I get a temporary flotation cell made for that. And while that's ongoing, we can look at a new tool, terraforming drones. Some wisp of knowledge liberated from zapping a science flask informed us of the possibility that, if you blew one of those big holes into the ground and then immediately dropped several hundred metric tons of dirt on top of it, you can get rid of pesky barren land and replace it with arable land. This aligns with the Terraform goal in the tab on the left, which wants us to replace a load of black, purple and volcanic land with something a bit more conducive to life. You can see it in action here. Watch as we replace this barren black terrain and the Terraform goal creeps up. The demand from all of the fertiliser and soon the fish on my algae supply was beginning to cause a shortage, so I built a whole new algae farm to compensate. I also set up tier 2 solar panels and grid batteries in my mall, as these are ingredients for satellites, and we are now on the lead up to our next science, which would require launching satellites into orbit. All the while now, the barrage of soil continues, slowly creeping up the Terraform goal. Whilst rearranging my chassis' equipment grid, I made the timeless mistake. Still waiting on the fishies to craft due to a crippling nucleotide shortage, I built an extra grass farm so I can breed more wormies and melt more wormy eggs into nucleotides. Still waiting on fishies, I start the process of upgrading all of the labs. Speed isn't a concern, but the extra module slot it provides means we get even more productivity, which over enough time, the cost of the lab and the module is negligible and it's essentially free science. I missed the finishing of the terraforming goal due to more OBS pausing shenanigans, but it's just a load of dirt, who cares anyway. I also get a new tier of chassis with a ridiculously large equipment grid, and immediately fill it with everything I can think of. Having suffered the baby Spidertron for so long, finally reaching the point now where I have access to a big Spidertron is a massive relief. This thing is a beast, much faster, with a massive storage and equipment grid, as well as literally having 2 artillery cannons strapped to it for short-range drone launching. Aware that one day this planet must be seeded with biters, I decided it's a good idea to start digging out a moat around an island where I'll house them. Unfortunately, super nukes don't mix well with short-range drone launchers, so I try that again, launching the super nukes into the literal corner of my screen and still running away each time to make sure I'm safe. It is super safe until you forget to do it, and then you're super not safe. Finally, it's time for the fish science, ichthyology research. You know how it goes. Fish progenitor, a load of fish, and finally the mystery third ingredient this time is a lot of wastewater. Soon, probably the most anticipated technology finishes, Ecology 2, which unlocks grass drones. Let's be honest, even with the dirt drones, this environment sucks. So it's time to make it look a bit less sucky. Launching a horticulture drone gives us a massive lag spike and an even larger patch of grass, contributing towards the grass goal. I immediately get to work covering as much of my base in grass as possible, as it's far prettier than the mishmash of barren terrain we had previously. Although it's been hours since we started creating life on this planet, this is the first time the place has really felt alive. Of course, our biter island needs to be fully covered in grass. Whilst we've been focusing so much on biology recently, a massive development in our material sciences has occurred. I placed down rocket silos, and it's finally time to divert some of our attention to the stars and what they can offer to us. You'll notice that I've placed 2 rocket silos, and although we'll only be launching satellites in one, there is a good reason for the other, as you will see later. Suffice to say, these rockets take a lot of materials. I won't list them all, but you can see how many requests I've had to make in this logistics chest. Rather than having to craft 100 rocket parts like in vanilla, the rocket is crafting as a single, very expensive part, which means every time the productivity bar fills, we get an entire rocket for free. The massive lag spikes here are just from me launching grass drones in the background. Satellites take their own mess of components, and each one we launch gives us 100 boxes of astronomical research, or 500 packs. I set a circuit condition on the silo to only insert a satellite if there is room in storage to fit the science packs. As similar to vanilla, if a satellite launches with no room to put the science packs, you use the satellite but still don't get the science. I'm placing more beacons when the first rocket finishes crafting, and it is a magnificent sight after 140 hours. It's not even the end, not even nearly the end. but it made me feel that much closer to finishing this juggernaut of a mod. Just as suddenly as it started, it's over, and it's time to get back into the grind. The other rocket pops out of its silo too, but it'll be a while yet before we get any use out of it. Rather than do anything fancy with belts to get this 7th science pack into the labs, I instead decide to simply use requester chests to get them into the first row of labs, from which they are then proliferated as usual. With all of the progenitors we're going to need to use between science packs and drones, I've actually got a genome shortage, so I set up these nanofabricators to make a lot more of the first few genomes. Another massive shortage we're having is rocket fuel, to solve which, my first step is to build a larger explosive build. I didn't talk about this new explosive recipe much when I first made it, but it's another one of those recipes which have been massively improved by the introduction of biology. Comparing it with the old recipe, we're basically adding a bit more glycerol, some cellulose, and aluminum powder, and getting 4 times more explosives. That's a trade I'm more than willing to make. Easily my favourite part of pasting builds is the wall of bots that arrive to do my bidding, which you can sort of see in the corner here. Rocket fuel is the same as before, but this time I've got together a much prettier build. I can let you know what the other rocket silo does now, as I've just unlocked the asteroid mining technology. Essentially, we launch up a rocket with a miner, and it has a chance to catch an asteroid, which we can guide down to the planet, making our own ore patches or enriching those we already have. As I set up the launchers for the guiding drones, you'll notice that there are 6 of them, despite the planet only having 4 types of resources, not counting fumaroles. Well, you see, that's the problem. The planet lacks in heavy elements like copper and uranium, and it's our job to bring some down from space. Not only are they required for the terraforming goals, but also because they are of immense use to us. Copper for more advanced electronics, and uranium for fission power, which is a lot cheaper than fusion. The first guide drone I get is for an iron ore meteorite, which I target at my main iron mine, adding more than 2 million ore to the patch. I soon get my first copper drone too, which I shoot over to the left of my titanium setup, where I plan to process the copper. You'll see, it also bumped up the copper goal on the left. We still have some research to do before we can process that copper, so in the meantime, I work on a new type of nuclear fuel we've just researched. You see, some guy figured out that if you smack a high energy neutron into a lithium atom, you split it into tritium and helium. So by using this process we can turn fission cells into more tritium than it took to make them, effectively breeding the tritium. Once the breeder cell has been used up in a reactor, we can just empty out the tritium and helium, as well as a bit of lithium, and use the tritium to make more fusion cells to make more breeder cells. I use this pair of reactors to burn the cells, which gives us a free bit of power in the process of giving us the massive amount of power all this extra tritium will provide. Back on the biological end of progress, I've started turning fish into oil and the eggs into nucleotides. This is going to be important in a moment, but first I'm pleased to announce that we just got our first uranium guide drone. For some reason, I decided to launch it into the boonies. I suppose I thought I was going to use that bauxite patch at some point, or maybe it's just my residual disgust for building over ore patches. Anyway, so if we combine the oil with steam, we split it into fatty acids and glycerol, and just like that, all of the pillars of life are being produced by biological means. With the copper processing tech researched, it's about time we get down to work processing it. Naturally, this begins with mining the copper itself. The copper is then crushed before being combined with a mix of sulfuric acid and solvent, which dissolves it into copper solution. We then zap the copper out of the solution in an electrolyzer, giving us copper ingots, which we can then turn into sheets and wires. Now for uranium processing. The first step is actually to barrel up some tritium, as it is needed in the process, and sending tritium over by pipe is a waste with such a low volume resource. In preparation for the new age of cheap nuclear power that uranium will provide us, I actually bother to set up tier 3 Stirling engines. They take a lot of helium and other expensive materials, but for convenience they are unparalleled. Again, the first step in uranium processing is to actually mine the stuff, and in a move not common for Nullius, it's actually easier than vanilla, as it requires no fluid inputs to mine. The facade of relative ease is shattered when we start crushing, which spits out mineral dust I'm going to simply shunt off onto the logistics network. The crushed uranium can then be combined with sulfuric acid, which gives us yellow cake, a precursor for further nuclear material. If we bake the yellow cake with soda ash, we get uranium, gravel, and sulfur dioxide. If I was being 100% efficient, I could feed the gas back to make more sulfuric acid, but I just don't care enough to do anything but void it. Combining uranium with tritium gives us enriched uranium, deuterium, and mineral dust. We still haven't finished research for fission cells, so right now, this is as far as we can go with this line. Just a quick aside, I also unlocked a new insulation recipe using wood to add onto the pile of recipes which have benefited from our biological research. Pretty soon, the research for fission cells finishes, and all they take to craft is steel sheets, uranium, and enriched uranium, giving us a handy 4 gigajoules of energy for less tritium than a fusion cell costs. I start to trial a 3x3 reactor, as with this layout, the central reactor would get the maximum neighbour bonus possible. 4 reactors would get a 3-sided neighbour bonus, and the other 4 would get a 2-sided neighbour bonus, a massive efficiency boost overall. In vanilla this isn't feasible without having to hand feed the central reactor, but we have some tools in this run that change that. Those tools are a suite of logistics buildings introduced from Renai Transportation, which are going to allow us to throw in items from afar. I end up with this, and although the method of fuel cell delivery is different, the philosophy is largely the same as the last reactor. Only add cells when one is removed, and only remove cells when the reactor temperature is low. You can see how using the Stirling engines make this build far simpler than the old reactor. Why stop at 2 reactor setups though? I might as well add another while I'm at it, and then why not add a third one entirely to utilise breeder cells? It's around here I finally get a use for copper, as we've just unlocked blue circuits. At the moment they don't really serve any use, but they're going to be required in some advanced modules and equipment. Soon, I get back into the boonies to cut off this piece of land I selected to be my biter sanctuary. We've just recently unlocked wormy drones, which are going to allow us to deposit worms into the wild. I begin immediately depositing them along the south shore of my biter island. The first few increase the worm goal, but don't seem to actually be doing any worming at all, only leaving weird marks on the surface, but soon we start to see some good old wormies poking out. I just recently unlocked antimatter traps, which when burnt in a reactor turn into antimatter capsules, which we're going to use later, but I'm setting it up now as a surprising amount of the materials for the final goal are able to be made already, including this one. Something else we need to think about now is carbon sequestration, as pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere will help to increase our oxygen goal. And the graphite this produces we're going to need anyway later to turn into coal for the coal mission objective. I use this extremely fast graphite recipe to rapidly use up a lot of carbon dioxide, and the graphite will just store for now in this field of storage chests. At the same time, I'm continuing my worm invasion of the planet, and by now, big worms are starting to appear. Our final organism finally finished researching, the humble biter, or arthropod as the mod calls them, and we of course begin with the genomes and then the progenitors. The requirements to produce biters verge on silly, as it eats fish, wood chips, water, oxygen, as well as, for a bit of crunch, pistols and ammunition boxes. The science packs take the usual progenitor and biters, as well as a load of plastic, as the biter's particular niche is as a biological source of plastic and graphene, although I don't make a massive amount of use of this. The immediate sense I had looking at all the biology I'd built was that we were going to need more, so that's exactly what I'm going to do next. That begins with flattening out this whole area to the west to build it. However much algae we had before, I'll have 4 of them. However much grass I had before, I'll have 2 of those please. Make it 4 actually. How many wormies did we have before? Oh well, we're going to need at least 4 times that. Fishies? Couldn't get enough of the little fellas, bring them in. Trees? Never had enough of the bastards. Deforestation and all that. Biters? Only just met the buggers. What will I'll have a couple of them. Combining methanol and fatty acids gives biodiesel. Combining that with nitrogen, rubber and graphite gives us coal, which, although being absolutely useless to us really, we can shot into a drone and punt into the ground to trap some carbon from the atmosphere and add a few percentages to our coal goal. We will also have to start making petroleum soon for a similar purpose. Queuing up the final research required to finish the mod, we can see it really isn't that far away. Our new biology setup gives me access to an unprecedented amount of fish for us to turn into oil into fatty acids into diesel into coalify, as well as turn into oil into fatty acids into petroleumify. Coal we've already spoken about, but petroleum I'll explain. By combining fatty acids, propane and compressed hydrogen, we get petroleum, 10,000 barrels of which can be put into a drone and shot into the ground to lock away some carbon and hydrogen, as well as fulfilling some of the petroleum mission objective. Even though my production probably can't keep up with it right now, I copied down another biology lab setup because I'm clearly feeling very optimistic. I utilise, quite possibly, the most beneficial biology recipe yet, where we blend biters into cellulose, plastic and graphene. Up until this point, graphene was immensely expensive and time consuming to make, so for it now to be produced so freely is of massive benefit. Something else I just unlocked was the highest tier of modules, which is going to be our first and highest demand use for blue circuits, as tier 3 haste modules use them. My first use for tier 3 yield modules is all my labs and rocket silos naturally. By now I'd collected so many guide drones, I decided to just swap both silos to producing science. Our next big milestone research is next, tree drones. Trees need to be grown on grass and near worms, so my first target for them is of course the Biter Island, which is already inundated with worms. I waste no time covering as much surface area with trees as possible, as the oxygen goal is still far from done, and this third species of plant should hopefully put oxygen production into overdrive. The natural enemy of trees is fumaroles for some reason. They won't grow anywhere near the things, so my natural reaction is to go and nuke them out of existence and then pave it over with dirt and grass. And for those wondering, yes, the worms are hostile to us. It's not long, as it turns out, until we complete the tree objective. Things are speeding up now, as not long after finishing that objective, we unlock fish drones to start cracking away at the next objective. Whilst everything is happening from now on, it might be worth keeping an eye on how fast the oxygen goal grows with all these plants we've sent out. Fish just need to be placed in water near algae, and my first drone gets launched into the lake just north of my base here. I'm focusing a lot of the fish drones around the shores of the Biter Island, as they're actually a requirement for biters to survive. It doesn't take very long at all for the fish objective to complete, although I do still keep fish drone production going in case I need to make anywhere else habitable to biters later. Here's a quick time lapse of the base whilst I wait for stuff to research. By this point in the run, I was beginning to get slightly tired and spent more and more of my time just AFKing, coming back to work on any bottlenecks or important new researches. Another quick update on the tech tree, we only have 12 technologies remaining until the end of the run now. I spent a bit of time here prettying up my starting area, as by the end of the run I wanted it to look like it had never been touched by technology. Realising I didn't have a backup for if the Biter Island can't hold all the biters I need for the objective, I set to work digging a moat by way of nuclear bombs around my base. Once I completed the coal objective, I can at least focus all of my oil into making petroleum, which should massively speed up that objective. Biter drones finish researching, so I get the drone launcher set up for them. You'll notice I've surrounded the launcher in walls, and there is a good reason for that you're going to see momentarily. Biter drones actually require shackles to craft, which up until this point I had assumed was some sort of troll item, since all they seem to do is slow down the player if you put them in your equipment grid. Unfortunately, I neglected to place a Renai hatch on the launcher to catch the thrown biter drone, so the first one just got eaten. I didn't realise this was what the issue was, and I ended up just using a regular inserter in the end. Anyway, time for the moment of truth. I launched my first biter drone out onto the island and it successfully plants a nest. Fantastic. I get to work planting more and quickly we're starting to build a community of the brutes. As a cherry on top, the oxygen goal finishes around now, leaving us only 3 more objectives to complete, 2 of which we're already working on. You're about to find out the reason for those walls now, as we have a containment breach whilst launching new nests. I knew it could happen, which is why I built the walls, but I expected the biter to spawn from the launcher, not like 10 tiles away outside the walls. I dispatch it anyway, but it's clear these walls cannot be trusted. We're researching laser turrets to automatically kill biters, or as the description says, train mobile organic life forms to remain in their designated habitat. But if I'm honest with you, I'll probably finish the biter objective before the research finishes. Every nest we launch increases evolution, so pretty quickly we have crowds of large biters and spitters. I even launched some nests at my old base, hoping the biters might demolish it so I don't have to, but I forget to send fish first, so the nests don't plant. Once I fix that and send some more nests over to near the old base, I finish the biter objective, and all that's left now is the petroleum and probe goal. Both of these are just a matter of time now. Probes for the research to finish, and petroleum for the last few drones to produce. And wait, I do. I could, and perhaps should, spend time building up more production, but what I actually did was just bugger off and let it run, coming back to fix any bottlenecks when they occur. It's not the most elegant ending, but I'd done all this work up to this point, and I'd be damned if I was doing any more. I come back and finish off the petroleum goal, and then I have a checkpoint to do prior to the final research of the run, being to place a tier 2 android. I should probably explain the probe goal now. You see, if you remember right back to the start of the run, I explained what a von Neumann probe is. A drone which is sent out into space, lands on a planet, produces copies of itself, and launches those out into the universe infinitely. These are our copies, which we're going to package into probes and send out to start their own little Nullius runs on other planets. Finally, the probe research finishes and I can start producing the culmination of all of our efforts. For the low cost of most of the items I've ever produced in one way or another, and a crafting tree that looks like this, we've got ourselves a lovely little probe which when launched will give us a lot of science and like 10% of our final mission objective. Alright then, let's get a few of the bastards launched. Soon enough, we launch our 10th and final drone. I'll just let you bask in this victory screen for a moment now, as 184 hours in game, 4 months of effort, all come to fruition here. All that's left to do now is return to where we began. Sit down on the shores of this once barren lake we crash landed next to oh so long ago, and watch over a grateful and life-filled planet. Special thanks to my Ko-Fi supporters, Acrid Arsonist, Orome, Dick Dastardly Enthusiast, Scurvy, Watcher, Greenest God, Dr. Ducklumps, Shronkuvi, Leo, Das Tom, Thomas, Foxtrot 9000, Nathan 14321, Two Step SA, Hunter, The Fiendish, Michael Shawning, Justice, Hey1121, Japamela, Ion Burger, Promoron, Wapdragon, Zach, Lula, Benjamin Gagney, MIG, Deadly Mitten, Dampire, Just Be Cool, Diceken, and Libo the Gazebo.